They were designed to be the best. They met enemies face to face, endured tragedies and enjoyed victories. They went down in history due to the bravery of their crews. They are the ships that deserve to be called naval legends. In this episode, Battleship Iowa, a trump card that was never played. In the 1930s, the whole world was crazy about two things: swing music and guns. The passion that politicians and industrial moguls showed to the latter had all the signs of gigantomania. By finding legal loopholes in international arms control treaties and conventions, or simply ignoring them, countries were constantly building new and unprecedented weapon systems for both land and sea. They were becoming bigger, heavier, and more powerful. The global arms race involved the most advanced technologies of the time and huge financial resources.
In order to compete with any of our potential enemies, it was felt necessary to increase the size of our ships. So the Iowa was a 45,000-ton battleship. The prior ships had been less, the South Dakota class and the North Carolina class.
A battleship is basically a floating artillery battery, so her size directly depends on the size of her primary guns.
The 16-inch main batteries on Battleship Iowa, of which there are three turrets. Each turret has 3 guns. So everything about the ship design is structured around being a platform for the 16-inch guns.
It's like small arms. There is a common misbelief that the pistol is designed first and then the cartridge. No, the Defense Ministry always orders the cartridge. The same for ships. The enemy is 380 millimeters and 305 millimeters. Let's make 406 millimeters because we already have some of the technologies. But let's not make it 40, but 50 calibers long. And they made a 406 millimeter gun. So the ship was built to carry this particular gun.
Key specifications of Battleship Iowa. Total displacement, 57,540 tons. Length, 270.5 meters. Beam, 33 meters. Draft, 11 meters. Armament. Primary armament, 9 Mark 7 guns in 3 triple turrets. Caliber, 406 millimeters. Maximum range, 39 kilometers. Dual-purpose artillery, 20 Mark 12 guns in 10 coaxial Mark 28 turrets. Caliber, 127 millimeters. Anti-aircraft armament, 19 quadruple Bofors guns. 52 Oerlikon Mark 234 autocannons. Air group, 3 Vought OS-2U Kingfisher floatplanes. During construction, Iowa's armor was declared higher than it actually was in order to mislead the enemy. The real specifications are as follows. Main belt, 307 millimeters. Main turrets, 184 to 432 millimeters. Conning tower, 184 to 440 millimeters. Main armor deck, 153 to 179 millimeters. Iowa has the most powerful power plant among battleships. 4 geared turbine engines with 8 turbines produced by General Electric, 8 boilers produced by Babcock and Wilcox. Power, 212,000 horsepower. Maximum speed, about 33 knots. Cruising range, about 20,000 nautical miles at a speed of 15 knots.
Battleship Iowa had a very unique hull design in the bullnose. And you can also see that her lines were very tapered, almost aerodynamic. And that's all part and parcel of how they got this 57,000-ton behemoth up to a speed of 33 knots, which is very, very fast and almost, you could say it's almost powerboat speed, you know, very, very unusual for a warship.
This became an important advantage later on during the war in the Pacific Theater. With a speed like that, Iowa could efficiently escort carrier task forces.
They put about 140 20-millimeter and 40-millimeter anti-aircraft guns on the ship, and the carriers loved them because they were able to protect the carrier.
When Iowa was still under construction, the Americans realized that she would play a secondary role in battles against the Japanese fleet. Aircraft carriers were becoming the main striking force of the Navy, but a giant like Iowa played a worthy role in the World War II.
Battleship Iowa was commissioned in early 1943. Its first mission was to go north. Naval intelligence felt the Tirpitz, the German battleship, may be coming into the North Atlantic. The battleship Iowa was sent on an early mission north to block the Tirpitz.
Suppose battleships Iowa and Tirpitz met in battle. Iowa had a higher speed, greater maneuverability, and longer range of fire. Tirpitz would be trying to get in close to Iowa, and Iowa would be looking to keep away, maneuvering and firing at Tirpitz from a great distance. Iowa would have definitely won this battle.
But the two naval heavyweight warriors never met. So we can only imagine how their duel would have ended.
Then, on their second mission in October 12th of 1943, was to accompany, or I should say, carry Franklin Roosevelt across the Atlantic to North Africa. From there, he went on to visit with Churchill and Stalin in the Tehran Conference. Roosevelt was on board the ship for 15 days. When President Roosevelt came on board, the first thing he saw was Vicky. Now, the first captain, Captain John McCrae, brought little dog home one day, and his wife looked at the dog and said, "Get that thing out of here." So the Captain McCrae took the dog and brought him on the ship. And President Roosevelt asked, "Who is this little dog?" And Captain McCrae said, "Well, that's our little ship's mascot named Vicky." So Vicky spent the whole 15 days of the Roosevelt passage in the cabin with Roosevelt. He would play tricks. While he wasn't very good as a sailor, he was very good as a dog. And Roosevelt really enjoyed Vicky.
In early 1944, battleship Iowa joined the United States Fifth Fleet, which operated in the Pacific Ocean. By that time, US forces were already attacking Japanese positions on various islands. The battleship's role was to provide fire support to landing troops and escort aircraft carriers during air raids on the Philippines, the Ryukyu Islands, and Taiwan.
The ship crisscrossing across a lot of these small islands that are really forgotten now. At one point, they went up to support MacArthur's landing in the Philippines at Leyte Gulf. Unfortunately, they went the wrong way at Leyte Gulf and chased a Japanese carrier force that was really a decoy for the landing. They came back, but a little too late to assist in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. They missed that one opportunity to maybe have had a contact with the Yamato.
The two ships never met in combat, and both countries kept their capital battleships, shall we say, arm's length, kept them at distance, because there was great political risk to having either one of the ships damaged severely in battle.
Japanese industry in those days simply didn't have the resources to build ships in large numbers. The solution was simple: to make huge ships that would exceed the largest ships of other nations. Super battleships.
Battleship Yamato is the biggest battleship in the world. Her shell velocity was 790 meters per second, while its weight could be up to 1.5 tons. Such a large gun could inflict very serious damage.
The Japanese essentially broke the treaty.
On the other side, the United States of America was simply building a ship that met the contemporary requirements of naval warfare and could easily, without any extra effort, be built by the American industry.
During the war, the Japanese fleet could afford to build only 2 battleships, while the Americans were able to construct more and more new battleships.
The Americans were simply building another ship, and she turned out to be a good one.
The Iowa, I think, would have, of course I would probably say this, would have taken the day in a battle against the Yamato.
She had very accurate fire control for a ship of the 1940s. And I think that would be an advantage for her if they should fight such a battle.
It was so accurate that in 1984, when they recommissioned the ship, they kept the existing system in place. They did, even though they had modern computers. The Iowa could put a round very, very close to the target, so accurate that they didn't need to change it.
Iowa was the most dangerous enemy for a Yamato. If they had met at a range from 20,000 to 30,000 meters, especially in a one-on-one fight and in fine weather, Iowa would have no chance of winning. However, thanks to better radar, Iowa could fight in bad weather and at night. Powerful guns, high speed, and precise radar made Iowa a formidable adversary. If these two battleships had fought each other, the victory would depend completely on the battle conditions.
We could get in quick and fire, but then there's always the lucky shot.
The changing tactics of naval warfare increased the role of aircraft carriers and deprived Iowa of a chance to use its primary armament against surface ships. So the battleship used its firepower against the enemy's coastal positions. On August the 29th, 1945, when the war was virtually over, Iowa stood side by side with her sister ship Missouri and entered the Tokyo Bay as part of the occupation force.
We were next to our sister ship, the Missouri, and the Missouri, of course, is where Douglas MacArthur accepted the final surrender of the Japanese. Now, we like to say on the Iowa that had Roosevelt lived, that signing might have been on the Iowa because he had been on the ship. But President Truman was from the state of Missouri, and so the signing was on the Missouri. Some of a sailor that was on that trip once told me that I asked him if he was sad that he didn't get the signing instead of the Missouri. And he said, no, not really. He said the war was over, we had lived, we were going home to our wives and children, and all the guys on the Missouri were busy preparing a photo opportunity for Douglas MacArthur.
Upon witness surrender of the Japanese Imperial forces,
At the end of the war, we brought back a large number of American POWs, Japanese prisoners of war, and we brought them home and sailed through the Golden Gate Bridge, and the war was over.
For her service in World War II, the battleship was decorated with 9 battle stars. In 1949, Iowa was decommissioned into the reserve fleet, but 2 years later, she was recommissioned and sent on a mission to the coast of Korea. The battleship returned home with 2 more battle stars. From 1958 to 1984, Iowa was kept in reserve, and after modernization, she returned to active service again. However, the event that took place in the late 1980s showed that battleships can also sustain losses outside of wartime.
On April 19th, 1989, the biggest tragedy that ever struck this ship occurred. The ship was about 400 miles or so north of Puerto Rico. As I understand it, they had loaded the shell in the number 2 turret, rammed in the powder, and they were about to close the breach when something happened. There was an explosion that killed 47 men. It was by far the biggest loss of life on the ship.
Having recovered from the tragedy, the battleship returned home and joined the reserve fleet. In 2001, 58 years since her launch by the New York Naval Shipyard, after she had crossed tens of thousands of miles and fired thousands of shells at the enemies, Battleship Iowa was berthed in the port of Los Angeles.
She's unique because she did have 3 careers in the Navy, World War II, Korea, and the 1980s. And then now she's on her 4th career as a museum ship.
stay calm.
You can activate your bonus code up to April 27th. Don't panic, stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe, as there are more bonus codes to come. Have a lovely time. Fair winds and following seas.
At the beginning of the 20th century, the Russian Navy experienced a series of shocks that brought it to its knees. The first significant hit came with the Russo-Japanese War, when the Russian Empire lost almost all of its big ships. Then World War I, the Russian Revolution of 1917, and the bloody civil war that followed destroyed both the empire and its navy. Nevertheless, the Bolsheviks looked to the future with optimism when they started building the new socialist state. They saw a future in which the mightiest ships in the world, Soviet ships, would sail on the high seas, protecting the peace and prosperity of the Soviet Union.
In 1927, with the threat of war in the past and diplomatic relations with Great Britain broken, it became obvious that the Soviet Union couldn't repel an attack, even if it came from neighboring Poland and Romania. For this reason, in 1928, the state approved a program for the first 5-year plans. These resulted in the development of their heavy industry, particularly the metallurgy industry, which enabled the start of military construction and the development of the armed forces. So the state approved the program for building large capital ships within the framework, developing the armed forces and military construction.
The program of large shipbuilding adopted in 1936 presupposed that in the following 10 years, it would introduce around 530 ships of the primary types into service, with a total displacement of more than 1.3 million tons. Battleships were planned to have comprised half of that tonnage.
The funniest part of this was that not a single great country in the world, out of their potential enemies, considered the Soviet Union as an enemy they might battle at sea. That's why they were completely indifferent to anything that the Soviet Union planned to construct. Moreover, one shouldn't forget that the Soviet state was absolutely closed. Everyone was under suspicion. Everything was top secret. That's why the countries of the West didn't even suspect that we were planning or building anything.
Soviet shipbuilders based their knowledge of how a battleship of that era was supposed to be on the characteristics of the new heavy ships being built by leading sea states in the mid-1930s. In February 1936, the requirements specifications for designing a Baltic Sea battleship, Project 21, and a Pacific Ocean battleship, Project 23, were formulated. After revisions of the technical requirements specification of Project 23, it was named as a Type A battleship. In the spring of 1937, when officials of the Soviet Union learnt that the Japanese and Germans had started building battleships with a minimum displacement of 50,000 tons, the Ministry of the Shipbuilding Industry suggested that the Design Bureau should rework the project without any limitations in a period of 3 months. In November 1937, Project 23 received its third revision. After 18 months, its final requirements specification were approved, and by that time, 2 ships were already under construction.
The ships should have been built in series, 4 battleships at a time. The keel of flagship Sovietsky Soyuz was laid down in Leningrad. The hulls of Sovetskaya Rossiya and Sovetskaya Belorussia were laid down in Molotovsk, which is now called Severodvinsk, and another, the hull of Sovetskaya Ukraina in Nikolaev.
Performance characteristics of Project 23 battleship, 1939. Length, almost 270 meters. Width, almost 39 meters. Draft, 10.45 meters. Full displacement, 65,150 tons. Armor. Primary armor belt, 375 to 420 millimeters. Total horizontal armor, 230 millimeters. Main battery turrets, 230 to 495 millimeters. Armament. Main battery, 9 406mm B-37 guns in 3 turrets. Secondary battery, 12 152mm B-38 guns in 6 turret mounts. AA battery, 4 twin mounts with 100mm B-54 guns. 8 37mm quadruple 46K machine guns. Aircraft armament, 4 Core 2 seaplanes. Main propulsion plant, 6 water tube boilers and 3 main geared turbine units. Full power, 231,000 HP. Maximum speed, 28 knots. Travel distance, 7,200 miles at a speed of 14 knots. According to the shipbuilding program of 1938 to 1945, approved by the USSR Committee of Defense, the following number of ships were planned for introduction into service. 6 battleships for the Pacific Ocean Fleet, 4 for the Baltic Sea Fleet, 3 for the Black Sea Fleet, and 2 for the Northern Fleet.
What does it mean to build 15 battleships? Can you imagine the required industrial base? These battleships required special factories to produce their ammunition, artillery mounts, machinery, and so on. The entire economy of the country was geared towards this.
At the time the ships of Project 23 Sovietsky Soyuz were laid down, the Soviet Union was suffering from a severe lack of shipbuilding facilities which could hold such heavy ships. For that reason, a factory in Molotovsk, known now as Severodvinsk, was constructed. It had 2 roof dockyards, which were used for constructing ship hulls all year round. It allowed the construction of ships in the severe North climatic weather conditions all year round. The weather conditions had no effect on production. Quite a desirable novelty in the world shipbuilding industry.
The difficulties that Soviet industry had to face during the construction of these ships were unprecedented. Delays in supplying steel for hulls to the shipyards, difficulties in producing armor at the required quality and volume, and most importantly, a lack of skilled specialists. Pre-revolution experience in designing and building large ships was partially lost or obsolete. And as a result, the young Soviet school of shipbuilders had to catch up on the trends of the time, fast.
Imagine you're an automobile engineer. You're called to Moscow and then told, today you'll be building not cars, but tanks T-80 or T-90. How would you respond? Perhaps you'd say, but I've never built anything like that. And they might respond, does that mean that you can't build a tank? Are you an enemy of the Soviet Union? A German spy? Now you've been brainwashed. It's neither bad nor good. It's just a fact. Plus, you're a member of the Communist Party. You're a patriot, and you almost certainly don't want to be executed by firing squad. All of those things in combination forced people to work, study, and learn new things. This is the phenomenon of Soviet engineers of the 1930s, 40s, and even 50s. They were working 12 to 16 hours a day. That was a particular Stalinist style, when a boss worked until 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening, and all of their subordinates did the same. What does it mean that you want to go home? Your boss is working. Your boss is thinking about how to build battleship Sovietsky Soyuz. Aren't you thinking about that as well? Yes, you are thinking about that too.
The authorities of the country and their armed forces were inspired by the successes of their industrialization, aviation industry, and tank building industry. They were excited about the shipbuilders, who never stopped refining and upgrading their projects, even after they had been laid down. Lacking the necessary experience, searching for optimal solutions required more extensive experiments and theoretical research, which couldn't be always accounted for in the approved terms of the construction program.
Everything was in a mess. Specialists, organization, etc. They had no idea how to put all of that together. The structure of the battleship was constantly changing. When engineers began laying down the keel, they were still working out what kind of battleship they should build. Why did this happen? Once again, we didn't have the technology. We didn't have an assembly line for battleships.
Technology had moved too far forward, and the Soviet engineers needed to build completely different ships compared to those which had been built by the Russian Empire. Obviously, that introduced some significant corrections into the general understanding of how ships should have looked. To advance their capabilities, they tried to acquire experience from abroad. So the Soviets contacted the United States, France, Germany, and Italy.
You should understand that it was the 20th century, and no country could build anything in total isolation and without help of other countries. First of all, they needed to research the battleships of foreign countries, starting with their potential enemies, caliber, speed, armor. The funny part was that all of this data was available in open sources.
Taking into account the fact that the firepower of any battleship is mostly in its primary guns, the firepower of Sovietsky Soyuz should have corresponded to the firepower of comparable foreign ships. At that time, the largest known foreign naval artillery guns had a caliber of 406mm. The project for a 406mm gun had been in development for the needs of the Russian Imperial Navy before the Russian Revolution of 1917. Almost 20 years later, Soviet engineers returned to that task. But there was a huge abyss between theoretical calculations and the practical implementation of that gun in its metal form. To cross that abyss, a bridge formed of new plants and production standards had to be built. As you might know, they successfully crossed that abyss. In 1940, the MP-10 test mount was installed at the Naval Artillery Test Range in Leningrad for testing gun B-37. By simply looking at that mount, one could easily imagine how enormous a battleship turret with 3 such guns would have been. The most outstanding part of the gun was its barrel, which weighed more than 137 tons without its housing. 2 blast furnaces were used simultaneously for casting blanks to produce the barrel. Then those gigantic cast slabs were forged on a press and processed on a huge bench, but with a length of around 36 meters. In general, it took around a year to produce a single barrel.
In terms of being a ballistic solution, the B-37 gun is one of the best in the world. It's inferior only to the 460mm gun of Yamato gun, but the latter has a larger caliber. And the US-made Mk7 gun, with its heavy 1,225kg shells, is better than the Soviet gun in a number of characteristics. Basically, it's the 3rd best gun in the world. Neither the Englishmen, nor the French, nor the Italians had a similar gun. Even the Germans didn't have anything like it.
Performance characteristics of gun B-37. Caliber 406mm, gun length 20 meters, barrel and breech block mass almost 137 tons, maximum firing range 45.6 kilometers, initial shell velocity 830 meters per second, firing rate 2 shots per minute.
On June 22, 1941, the Soviet Union stood as the world's largest industrial power. They had a colossal number of planes, tanks, and money for due to that. But as soon as World War II started, all of their forces were destroyed on the western border.
Leningrad was under siege. Nikolaev was captured, and a pretty significant amount of industrial power was lost with the Mariupol armor plant. It also became apparent that the war wasn't going to be fought at sea, but on land, so all of their forces and supplies were concentrated on provisioning the land front. Thus, the battleship construction program was halted.
Despite the fact that no battleships of the Sovietsky Soyuz class were built, their primary armament still found a purpose in combat, even though it wasn't at sea. During World War II, the MP-10 mount was added to Artillery Battery 1, the most powerful artillery unit with the longest range in the siege of Leningrad. Over the time of the city's defense, the B-37 gun fired a total of 185 shells at German positions, destroying several artillery batteries, an ammunition warehouse, and a reinforced concrete command post. During the offensive operation to liberate Leningrad that ran from January the 15th to the 20th, 1944, the gun fired 33 shells. One of the shells hit a power plant building that was occupied by Germans, razing the building to the ground.
After the war, the Soviet authorities considered finalizing the construction of Sovetskiy Soyuz's hull, but came to the realization that the ship didn't correspond to the post-war reality, primarily because of its AA defenses, but also because of its secondary armament. In addition to that, quite a peculiar thing happened. It was revealed that foreign spies had acquired data about the primary characteristics of the battleship. Thus, in 1949, the ship was sent for scrapping.
In general, if we analyze the economic situation of that time, we can say that we couldn't have built 15 battleships by 1946, even at the economic development level of that time. But let's imagine the opposite. Assume that nothing tragic happened in 1941, and Sovetskiy Soyuz had actually been built. What would the battleship represent if she had been launched? She would have been the most state-of-the-art battleship of that time. These ships could have provided security to the Soviet Union from all directions at sea, and furthermore, fight for supremacy in the theater of war of the seas.
One can review the capabilities of battleship Sovetskiy Soyuz as a tactical combat unit by comparing her with similar ships being designed in other countries at the time. The only similar ship that was actually built was Iowa. The British Lion and German H-class battleships, like Sovetskiy Soyuz, were never built. With respect to her size and displacement, Sovetskiy Soyuz was larger than the British Lion and was comparable with US and German battleships. However, she had much better armor than other battleships. Regarding her primary armament, all of these ships were equipped with 9 406mm guns, except for H-39, which should have had 8 guns. The main advantage of the guns installed on Sovetskiy Soyuz was the higher initial shell velocity, which provided a high degree of armor penetration and firing accuracy at short and medium distances. That's extremely important for the conditions of bad visibility that are quite common for the Baltic and North Seas. Moreover, the firing range of the Soviet guns was greater compared to the guns of Iowa and Lion. Taking into account that Sovetskiy Soyuz had been designed primarily to act within boundary waters, she was inferior to other ships in terms of her speed characteristics.
When you start analyzing the topic in such a manner, you begin to understand why these battleships were needed and that the country was capable of building them, and also that the design features of these ships fully corresponded to the situation in the world at that time.
If it weren't for the war, the Soviets would have built at least a single ship, possibly even 2. 2 ships wouldn't have resolved any geopolitical situations, but they would at least have been able to cool down some hotheads.
Even though they were never built, the Sovetskiy Soyuz-class battleships greatly influenced the entire scientific, technical, and production base of the USSR industry. Brand new metallurgical industrial sectors appeared, as well as shipyards, and cities were founded in the fields from the resulting infrastructure. The experience acquired by engineers working on the battleship project became the basis of the development of the post-war Soviet Navy. Those people who worked on Project 23 gained confidence in their abilities and bravely accepted the challenges of the new technological era. They went on to successfully create nuclear and guided missile ocean-going ships in the couple of dozen years that followed. You
can activate your bonus code up to April 27th. Don't panic, stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe, as there are more bonus codes to come. Have a lovely time. Fair winds and following seas.
They were designed to be the best. They met enemies face to face, endured tragedies and enjoyed victories. They went down in history due to the bravery of their crews. They are the ships that deserve to be called naval legends.
US battleship Alabama, British cruiser Belfast, and Polish destroyer Błyskawica. These ships are very different, but they all have one thing in common. The Bofors L-60. One of the best automatic anti-aircraft guns of World War II. It is estimated that this model of 40mm automatic cannon shot down more airplanes than all other anti-aircraft guns put together. Caliber, 40mm. Barrel weight, 103 kilograms. Barrel length, 56 calibers, 2,250mm. Loading principle, clips, 4 shots each. Rate of fire, 120 rounds per minute. Shell type, primarily fragmentation. Shell weight, around 900 grams. Maximum vertical range, 7,160 meters. Guns were installed in single, coaxial, quadruple, and 6-barreled mounts.
She became a very efficient gun for anti-aircraft and surface targets. As time progressed, the first of the Bofors that came online with the Royal Navy were hand-driven in terms of elevation and training, and they had a very basic sight system, and again, like a lot of early systems, they were reliant on training, ability of the aimers and the gun crew.
The specifics of World War II artillery relies on the fact that the smaller the caliber is, the more it depends on the gun crew, on their cohesion in combat. The performance characteristics of light guns, anti-aircraft guns, and Bofors in particular, are a combination of the artillery mount itself and the training and coordination of its crew. Especially in battle, when tensions are running very high, there's no time to think, and you need to move very fast, turn around, load new shells, and start firing. And all this happens automatically, without thinking. After a battle, sailors often couldn't even remember what they were doing. That level of performance was achieved through constant training.
This weapon is operated by a crew of 4. 3 on the mounting, the gun layer, the gun trainer, the loader. The 4th member carries the ammunition from the magazine and loads them into the clips on the side of the gun.
The L-60 was developed in neutral Sweden. Bofors, a metallurgy company, started manufacturing cannons around the 1870s. Then it was owned by the famous Alfred Nobel for a while. And after World War I, Bofors actively cooperated with the German Krupp Consortium. In March 1932, the official trials of the automatic anti-aircraft cannon L-60 were completed, and it was put on the market. In 1933, British and American military engineers studied the gun and were quite impressed. The Swedish system was more effective than the obsolete British Vickers pom-poms and had more firepower than the Chicago pianos used by the US. The maximum vertical range of Bofors was almost twice that of the British gun, and though the Swedish system had a slightly lower rate of fire than its American counterpart, The shells it used were twice as heavy. Great Britain, the USA and 10 other countries purchased a license to produce the gun. And by the beginning of World War II, both has exported their L-60 to 18 countries on different continents. In particular, Denmark, Greece, Egypt, Siam, Australia and Argentina. It wasn't just the Allies that used the Bofors L-60. Japanese forces captured several British guns in Singapore, and only their underdeveloped industry prevented them from mass producing them. The German Navy used L-60s captured in Poland, Norway and France from 1939, under the designation Flak 28. They were installed on submarines and cruisers Admiral Hipper and Prince Eugen. However, the Swedish gun wasn't ideal and required modernization.
After 300 rounds, it would be too hot and require the barrel to be changed. The barrel is air-cooled, and therefore the ambient temperature plays a great part in how long it would actually require to cool down.
During an intense battle, several hundreds or even thousands of shots are fired. That's why the issue of barrel replacement is so vital. This is why the gun crew was trained to carry out this maintenance under combat conditions. They could complete the procedure in mere seconds.
The mechanical drive system on ship-based anti-aircraft mounts would break down due to its exposure to salt water and needed to be replaced with a hydraulic one. The air cooling of the barrel also had to be replaced with water cooling. Also, some design modifications were required to mass-produce the gun. One of the main problems of the Bofors L-60's application was a high reliance on the training and skills of the gun crew.
The job of the loader is to carry or load the gun by lifting the clip, dropping into the weapon. So once he has done that, he then taps the gun layer on his head to let him know the gun is loaded.
Loading a gun like this wasn't easy. Ammunition had to be taken out of a box and carried to the gun. As the gun constantly rotated, the carrier had to run around it with a clip of shells in his hands to pass it to the loader.
This position on the gun is known as the trainer's position, and these handles are turned or reversed to allow the gun to move backwards and forwards on the target using the gratical sight in front of you. Following the tracer being fired from the gun, we can adjust for aim off if we are too far in front or too far behind the target, to allow the other side of the gun, which is the layers side, to then manufacture the elevation for the target.
As time went on, the gun developed, and so that we could come away from the hand-driven gun, she was turned into a hydraulic-driven gun, so she had pressure tanks and oils and such like. Which sped up the training and the elevation of the gun so that they could lock onto targets quicker.
This is the gun layer's position. He was also the captain of the gun and responsible for giving orders to the rest of the crew. He would, for instance, initiate the loading sequence by telling the loader to bring the gun to half cock. This means that the weapon can then be loaded with rounds into the auto feeder. He was also responsible for aiming the weapon using the 300-knot sight in front of him, using the tracers from the rounds to adjust accordingly.
The sight arrangement was going away from the spiderweb type of sight to a mirror type of sight, which was basically what we'd call a head-up display today.
On small displacement ships, anti-aircraft guns were aimed manually, but on cruisers, battleships and aircraft carriers, the firing data was produced by directors, special systems that controlled anti-aircraft artillery by calculating targeting parameters and sending them centrally to the receiving devices on guns. The information on target parameters was supplied by anti-aircraft rangefinders and later by gun radars.
The command to engage or fire comes directly from the command, and without further ado, the gun captain would press the firing push. As long as he held his foot on the firing push, the gun would continue to fire as long as it had enough ammunition in the hopper to keep feeding it.
The guns created a fire barrage, which was almost impossible for a single aircraft or entire squadrons to penetrate. You can see it in old newsreels. There's literally a wall of fire in the air, and some plane trying to get through it. The probability of an aircraft breaking through to its target, for example an aircraft carrier or some other ship, is very, very small.
The Bofors L-60 proved its worth during World War II. The anti-aircraft gun Bofors L-70 became its logical continuation.
The human factor is crucial in wars. A man can become frightened, maybe poorly trained, or something unexpected can happen to them. As a result, the struggle to minimize the influence of the human element and to increase the gun's survivability and rate of fire led to the development of the modernized Bofors L-70, which required minimal human input if compared to the very first Bofors gun, such as the L-60.
However, the L-60 remained in use on some ships. In 1982, during the Falklands War, which involved Great Britain and Argentina, the British managed to shoot down a jet plane using this Bofors gun. Even in the 1970s, when artillery was gradually replaced by missile systems, Bofors cannons remained in service. Not only the upgraded L-70s, but also the veteran L-60. It can still be found on some German minesweepers and the heavily armed US AC-130 gunships, which provide fire support to ground units.
Sailors, stay calm.
You can activate your bonus code up to April 27th. Don't panic, stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe, as there are more bonus codes to come. Have a lovely time. Fair winds and following seas.
Hamilton, Ontario is about 45 minutes southwest of Toronto. Here can be found HMCS Haida. She's the last of the Tribal class destroyers and is Canada's naval legend.
If you had asked a Canadian at the beginning of the 20th century to tell you about their country's navy, which has more than 240,000 kilometers of coastline, their answer would probably be no longer than this sentence. At that time, Canada was a dominion of the British Empire, and the defense of its sea borders was entirely under the authority of Whitehall.
The Canadian Navy didn't exist until 1910, okay? And then the First World War We had two old retired cruisers from the Royal Navy, but they did nothing. They just served as depot ships, basically. And a lot of it was, did we even have to have a Navy in the first place? And there was a big problem with the whole defense actually in the 30s. Do we even need it? And there wasn't really a goal, wasn't a need seen for the Canadian Navy.
In the first half of the 1930s, Japan, Italy, France and Germany were reinforcing their navies with brand new destroyers, carrying powerful artillery and torpedo armament. Of course, Great Britain didn't want to be an outsider in this race. In 1935, British engineers developed a destroyer that was able to successfully oppose the most powerful ships of this type at that time, the Japanese Fubuki-class destroyers. It became known as the Tribal class. As soon as the Royal Navy received 16 Tribals, British dominions expressed their desire to obtain the newest destroyers as quickly as possible, because the drums of the European war were already heard across the oceans. Canada mobilized.
One-tenth of Canada in 1939 had a population of 12 million. Okay? We had 1 million men and women in uniform. All of those people were volunteers. All the Canadian combatants were volunteers. So when you see those war graves in Normandy and in Holland, or whatever, or in Italy, those people were all volunteers.
During the war, as the Canadian Navy grew, mostly thanks to the addition of escort corvettes and frigates, its area of responsibility also increased, and in the end included the entire North Atlantic. Each new ship, even a modest minesweeper, contributed to the combat capability of the Allies at sea. Destroyer Hyder was laid down at the end of September of 1941 at a British Vickers Armstrong shipyard. The ship was commissioned 2 years later and was assigned to the Metropolitan Fleet. Specifications of Destroyer Hyder: length, almost 115 meters. Beam, more than 11 meters. Draft, 3.96 meters. Total displacement, 2,519 tons. Armament: primary armament, 6 Mark 12 guns installed in 3 twin turrets, caliber 120mm. Mark 16 dual-purpose guns in a twin mount, caliber 102mm. Anti-aircraft artillery, a Vickers Mark 7 quadruple anti-aircraft machine gun, pom-pom, caliber 40mm. 6 twin Oerlikon autocannons, caliber 20mm. Mine and torpedo armament, a quadruple torpedo launcher, caliber 533mm, 2 Mark IV mortars and an aft depth charge release gear. The ship carried 30 mines in reserve. Power plant, 3 Admiralty-type boilers and 2 Parsons geared steam turbines. Power, 44,000 horsepower. Maximum speed, 36 knots. Cruising range, 5,700 miles at 15 knots.
Haida's primary punch came from 3 twin 4.7-inch mounts. This was very heavy firepower for a destroyer of the era. They did come with a couple of advantages, as a few German destroyers discovered, but they also came with one significant disadvantage. The elevation was limited to only about 40 degrees on these mounts. In order to fix this, what they did was they replaced the 4.7s with twin 4-inch dual-purpose mounts, such as the ones behind me now. These could elevate up to 85 degrees and thus engage aircraft as well as surface targets out to about 14.5 kilometers.
From the very beginning, designers of the Tribal project put emphasis on reinforced artillery armament and planned to install 5 120mm twin turrets, 3 on the bow and 2 on the aft. The ship was conceived as a destroyer leader, and it was intended to partially complete the objectives of a light cruiser. Supporting squadrons of Allied destroyers, defending the main forces of the fleet against enemy destroyer attacks, and carrying out long-range reconnaissance and patrols.
One of the controversial design decisions when they were creating the Tribals was that they decided to reduce the torpedo complement in favor of the gun batteries. As a result, the Tribals were only equipped with a single quad mount for the 21-inch torpedoes, and these would go about 5 miles at 45 knots. The theory was that ordinarily the torpedo would be the main armament of a destroyer to sink ships, but it turns out in practice, Haida's kills were all done with gunfire. The torpedoes were aimed from the bridge wings. What would happen is once the trigger was pulled up there, a signal was sent to fire this shell casing, which has propellant. The gases would then expand within the reservoir here, push out the torpedo over the side of the ship. Of course, the stanchions will go down and then off towards the target. And each torpedo tube is labeled with a letter. And what you do is you always fire the aft torpedo first, because as the destroyer is moving, you want to make sure that they don't hit each other. Of course, having the ships is all very well, but they're not going to do very much without having the personnel to man them. Canada started off the war as basically a homeland defense force. She had 6 destroyers, a number of smaller vessels, and a navy of about 1,700 personnel. They had great possibilities for promotion though, because by the end of the war, Canada's navy had expanded to over 110,000 personnel and had the 3rd largest amount of surface vessels in the world.
Destroyer Haida began her combat career by escorting Russian Arctic convoys. At the end of December 1943, the German battlecruiser Scharnhorst tried to attack convoy JW-55B, which was escorted by Haida among others. However, the destroyer did not have a chance to participate in the destruction of the German raider. It was handled by her more heavyweight allies from the Metropolitan Fleet.
At the start of the Second World War, Canadian Navy came under the control of the Royal Navy. And they were controlled, operated basically controlled by the Royal Navy. It wasn't until later on, again, as the Canadian Navy grew, that we were looking for our own, we again became our own entity unto ourselves, okay? Just A, because of size, and B, because of where we were. But by and large, yes, the Canadian Navy was very much treated as colonials and second-class citizens, except for, again, this ship and the Tribals. These were the top of the form, and they bested the Brits at doing the same thing.
In January 1944, Haida was assigned to the 10th Destroyer Flotilla, which monitored the western part of the English Channel. On April 26th, during a patrol, her squadron discovered 3 German destroyers. Haida and her sister ship, Athabaskan, engaged the German T-29, which ended in the destruction of the latter. 1.5 months later, roughly in the same area, a battle took place in which Haida made herself famous and brought glory to the entire Royal Canadian Navy.
The 9th of June 1944 saw Haida partake in a rather spirited and very chaotic fight against the 8th Destroyer Flotilla of the German Navy. The 8th was a small force consisting of 3 destroyers, 2 Narviks, a captured Dutch ship, and a torpedo boat, whilst the 10th Destroyer Flotilla, of which Haida was a part, consisted of 2 4-ship divisions. The 19th was mainly inexperienced vessels, and the 20th was, shall we say, the A team. They had been told to intercept a German force which was known to be approaching the western approaches of the English Channel. And sure enough, contact was made at about 7 miles.
The German destroyers spotted the Allied ships first when they became highlighted by the moonlight. The Germans launched 12 torpedoes, but their adversaries managed to dodge them. An artillery battle broke out, and the Allies had total fire superiority. Haida and Huron concentrated fire on Z-24 and quickly achieved success. Almost the entire above-water part of the ship was destroyed and set ablaze. The enemy attempted to flee under the cover of a smokescreen. The flagship Z-32 continued fighting against Tartar and Ashanti on her own and took 3 hits. Z-32 turned right to put some distance between her and the Allies. Ashanti rushed after her. At this moment, the damaged ZH-1 became visible in the dissipating smoke. Her artillery quickly opened fire on Tartar, but Ashanti arrived in time and torpedoed the motionless ship. The torpedo explosion tore the ZH-1's bow away. Ashanti kept firing on the German destroyer. At 2:40, ZH-1 exploded and sank. Later that night, Canadian destroyers were sweeping the area and stumbled across the heavily damaged Z-32. Fleeing from them, Z-32 was driven ashore on the Ile de Batz, where in the morning she was finished off by British Beaufighter aircraft. The Allies managed to destroy 2 German destroyers and damage 2 more. After the successful battle on June the 9th, 1944, Haida and her allies continued to complete missions aimed at removing enemy ships from coastal waters.
During the fighting in the English Channel, Haida had a couple of advantages called radar. In fact, she had 3 of them. She had firstly a gunnery radar. This was accurate enough to spot fall of shot, both outbound and inbound, much to the consternation of the operators. She had warning combined, which is a fairly reliable radar, although it was well known to the Germans, and so the British and Canadians didn't like to use it unless contact was joined. And finally, she had warning surface, which was a pretty reliable radar, which would detect a destroyer-sized target at about 9 miles. All of these would prove vital in the night fighting in the English Channel.
Despite the fact that the German surface fleet was virtually non-existent by the end of June 1944, the naval war went on. The more success the Allies achieved in the land operations, the more desperately and fiercely German submarines opposed them at sea.
The time-honored method of dealing with an enemy submarine will be the depth charge, usually mounted on rails at the stern of the ship or maybe fired off the side with K-guns. The problem was that in order to hit your target, you had to go directly over it, which meant A, that you lost contact, and B, you actually had to be accurate enough to do it. The end replacement of it, however, was the squid mortar. Haida received her squids in the 1950s update. They replaced both the depth charge rails and the aft gun. Now, the advantage of squid was it was adjustable in range. No longer did you have to ride over your target in order to sink it. And they were fired automatically by means of a simple electrical connection attached to the sonar system inside the ship. Haida has a U-boat kill to her credit, U-971 in 1944, as Haida was protecting the western approaches to the English Channel during the invasion of France. Overall, the Royal Canadian Navy developed a reputation for ASW excellence. They sank about 30 U-boats, and in the post-war period, they became the de facto ASW force for NATO.
During World War II, the number of people in the Canadian Navy grew almost 70 times. And in all those years, Canadian sailors developed their own understanding of naval service, which was slightly different from the traditions of the British Royal Navy.
An interesting event in Canadian naval history happened in 1949 with what are known as the Canadian Mutinies. The word is a little bit strong for what happened, not least because the captain of Athabaskan accidentally on purpose left his cover on top of the written list of demands from the junior sailors, so he never officially saw anything. This happened on a couple of ships about the same time, not Haida, it should be noted, and what it really was more of a sit-down protest pending an airing of grievances. And this came down to something of a cultural difference between North Americans and people from England, where North American people, we tend to be a little bit more independent, shall we say. We like to know why we're doing it. We like to have a little bit more consideration, shall we say, from up above, instead of simply being told you're going to do this when, you know, like it or lump it. The officers were more steeped in the tradition of the Royal Navy, the British Navy, which perhaps was a little bit more autocratic. The end result of this, it all worked out fairly well, is that the Canadian Navy developed new policies which took greater concern of the requirements, shall we say, of the junior enlisted sailors.
Some people in the Canadian government believed that this incident was inspired by communist ideas, but this opinion was completely unjustified. Moreover, the destroyer was soon sent to Southeast Asia to fight against the Red Menace.
Again, the ship was converted to the way it is now. The armament was all changed, upgraded in 1951. And this is the way the ship was when it went to Korea in 1952. And that's where Haida became famous when it joined what they called the Train Busters Club. And this was a method of trying to destroy North Korean trains that ran along the coast at night. And it ran at night, figuring they couldn't be seen. So they ran and became a contest invented by the U.S. Navy to see if they could destroy these trains, train busters. In the history of the Train Busters Club, there were 25 trains destroyed. Haida is second in train busting with 2.5. Haida's record has always been superb gunnery actions. In fact, the current Canadian Navy trophy for gunnery expertise is named after Haida. It's the Haida Trophy for gunnery excellence.
During her second tour of duty in the Yellow Sea in 1954, Haida patrolled Korean shores, supervising the implementation of the ceasefire treaty supported by the United Nations. This was the first example of what we call today a peacekeeping mission, 10 years before this notion was introduced and became widely used. Haida reprised this role during the Suez Crisis of 1956.
The ship retired in October 1963, because again, the life of a warship is basically 20 years. And again, at that time, the Canadian Navy was expanding. They were building completely different types of ships. And again, the men that were needed on the tribals were needed to man other ships. So the tribals were scrapped. And it was that time that an ex-naval person, Neil Bruce, decided that it'd be try to preserve the ship as Canada's greatest ship and just preserve it as a tribal. And they were successful in that. An organization was formed, Haida Incorporated, and they acquired the ship from Crown Assets in 1964. They bought it for a huge sum at that time, $20,000. And it existed there as a museum, naval, National Historic Site.
If you asked a Canadian today to tell you about their country's Navy, which has more than 240,000 kilometers of coastline, then you would definitely hear a long story full of brilliant victories and heroic names. Especially Haida, a destroyer of the Royal Canadian Navy.
Sailors, stay calm.
You can activate your bonus code up to April 27th. Don't panic, stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe, as there are more bonus codes to come. Have a lovely time. Fair winds and following seas.
We're currently in the warehouse for the Explosion Museum now, where we keep many of our artifacts, very interesting guns.
At the beginning of World War II, Italy had quite a powerful navy. However, it wasn't powerful enough to take control of the Mediterranean Sea away from Great Britain. Starting from the 1920s, when the fascists came to power, Rome wanted to take back the Mare Nostrum, having ruled it 2,000 years prior. However, London clearly asserted who the leading power of the Mediterranean was at that time, with the havoc wreaked by 20 English torpedo bombers in November 1940. The Italians understood that they couldn't beat the British Navy out in the open, so they devised a plan for a covert war.
What we have here is a two-man submersible submarine that was designed by the Italians and used in the Second World War. This submersible submarine is an open submarine that is used for attacking ships that are tied alongside in their home ports, i.e. their own harbours.
It wasn't a brand new idea. At the end of World War I, the Italians developed and successfully employed a human torpedo. Two frogmen could covertly approach an enemy ship while controlling a torpedo apparatus. They detached the charge, transported in the torpedo bow, and suspended it under the ship's bottom on a tow line between bilge keels. They set the detonation time using a simple clock. In the mid-1930s, Italian forces renewed their interest in human torpedoes. Mussolini thought of this as the super weapon that was capable of destroying the British Navy, which threatened the Duce's imperial ambitions. In 1935, the Italians designed an experimental prototype based on the 533mm torpedo used by their navy. That same year, in the mouth of the Serchio River, between La Spezia and Livorno, the Italians established a secret guided torpedo training base, where the assault fleet frogmen could master the super weapon. The first torpedo prototypes were extremely hard to control and broke down often. That's why the Italian sailors nicknamed the apparatus a maiale, a pig.
The guidance system for this is all wires, so it's very difficult to steer. It's even more difficult to steer once the charges have gone, because you've got no bow as such to help you steer the chariot in the same place. When this was in use, many times this would be abandoned anyway, and the divers would be left to their own devices to find their own way back to the ship where they came from.
Model SLC, Siluro a lente corsa, slow-running torpedo, 1940. Its length, including the warhead, was 7.3 meters. Width of the apparatus was slightly more than half of a meter. Height at the protection plate level, 1 meter. Weight, including the warhead, 1,588 kilograms. Weight of the warhead at the earlier design stage was 220 kilograms. At the later stages, 250 or 350 kilograms. Power plant, 1 electric motor, 1.6 horsepower. Power supply, a storage battery. Operating voltage, 60 volts. Maximum speed, up to 3 knots. Submergence depth, up to 30 meters. Cruising range, up to 15 miles. Crew, 2 people. In 1943, Italian engineers designed a new guided torpedo model and called it Siluro San Bartolomeo, the St. Bartholomew torpedo.
The cockpit is open to water, so the divers will be wearing a full diving gear, which is their diving tanks, their masks and all the tubes that go with it. So as you can imagine, it's not very comfortable. and it can be quite awkward to travel around in that way.
Model SSB 1943. Length 6.8 meters. Width 0.8 meters. Height 1 meter. Weight, including the warhead, 2,200 kilograms. The carrier could be equipped with either a single 300 or 400 kilogram warhead, or two consecutively loaded warheads at 180 or 200 kilograms each. Power plant, one electric motor, 7.5 horsepower, supplied with a storage battery. Operating voltage, 60 volts. Maximum speed, 4 knots. Operating submergence depth, up to 30 meters. Crew, 2 people. On June the 10th, 1940, Italy joined World War II on Germany's side. At the same time, the Italian Navy officially adopted the SLC guided torpedo, and they immediately started their drills at the secret base in the mouth of the Serchio River for sabotage missions against the British Navy located in the Mediterranean Sea. In 1940–41, fleet frogmen on the SLC guided torpedoes executed 8 raids on the main British naval bases in Gibraltar, Malta and Alexandria. Most of the missions failed, but the Italians persistently mastered the combat application and equipment of their guided torpedoes.
The levers and the controls in here, apart from the steering controls, we have valves which control the air in the ballast tanks, again to assist the depth of the underwater submersible. The whole contraption is more like a fairground ride than it is a serious war machine. But you know, in 1942, 1943, when this was used, they were prepared to try anything, and they would launch these in the dead of night, and then they would go into harbours to cause as much damage as they possibly could.
At the end of 1941, the Axis launched another offensive on the English ships. The naval situation was more than just satisfactory. Owing to the successful actions of the German submarines, there were only 2 battleships left in the British Mediterranean fleet, Queen Elizabeth and Valiant. Both ships were located in the Alexandria port. On December the 14th, submarine Shearer, carrying 3 SLC guided torpedoes and 10 frogmen, left the secluded Porto Lago Bay on Leros Island and set sail towards Alexandria. On the 4th day of sailing, soon after sunset, the submarine reached its destination point, 1.5 miles from the Alexandria trading port. On December the 18th, 1941, around midnight, a commando team set off for a mission on 3 guided torpedoes. They were approaching the harbour entrance semi-submerged. The entrance was blocked by a steel net that could become a serious threat to the mission. But Fortuna smiled upon the frogmen. The English had removed the barriers to let their destroyers into the base. The Italians seized the moment and entered the harbour together with the destroyers. The teams separated once they'd entered the harbour. The mines were planted on Queen Elizabeth precisely as planned. The commandos fixed a tow line on the bilge keels and set up a charge exactly under the keel. The mines were also planted on tanker Sagona without any issues. But the crew that were mining battleship Valiant encountered some difficulties. Within a few meters of the ship, the breathing apparatus of one of the commandos failed, forcing him to surface. Then their torpedo died in the water and sank due to a technical failure. Lieutenant Luigi de la Penna trawled the torpedo all by himself and left it under the bottom of the battleship, close to the magazine of the first turret. In the morning of December the 19th, 3 explosions blasted in the Alexandria port. That's how 6 commandos on 3 guided torpedoes managed to shift the naval balance in the Mediterranean Sea in favor of the Italians. However, not for long. The Italians tried to keep their super weapon a secret, but the British successfully procured several of the human torpedoes. In August 1943, the guided torpedo fleet executed their last successful mission using the Maiali. Italy capitulated several weeks later, and all its military secrets fell into the hands of the Allies.
calm.
You can activate your bonus code up to April 27th. Don't panic, stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe, as there are more bonus codes to come. Have a lovely time. Fair winds and following seas.
They were designed to be the best. They met enemies face to face, endured tragedies and enjoyed victories. They went down in history due to the bravery of their crews. They are the ships that deserve to be called naval legends. In this episode, Project 7 destroyers, legendary Soviet Sevens. In Qingdao, eastern China, on the shores of the Yellow Sea, destroyer Anshan is docked at one of the port's moorages. She served in the Navy of the People's Republic of China for 30 years, but that's only one chapter in her biography. In the past, this destroyer was called Rekordny. She served in the Pacific Ocean, protecting the USSR's borders, and was one of 28 Project 7 destroyers, known to naval history enthusiasts as the legendary Soviet Sevens. The history of these destroyers began in the 1930s. After the Russian Civil War, the shipbuilding industry of the young Soviet state had to be rebuilt from scratch. By that time, the naval forces of the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army had only 17 destroyers that had been built before World War I.
Why destroyers? There's a saying, mighty oaks from little acorns grow. A destroyer is a versatile ship. She carries artillery, lays mines, fights off enemy planes, engages enemy ships, and conducts reconnaissance. She can carry out a multitude of missions. That's why this ship was intended for the Black Sea, the Baltic Sea, and to some extent the North Sea and the Pacific Ocean.
At that time, the Navy only had Noviks. Of course, they became completely obsolete, though at the time of their construction, they were the most powerful destroyers in the world. But by the 1930s, they were no match for their counterparts from the fleets of the greatest naval powers. That's why the Soviet Navy desperately needed a replacement for their destroyers.
The newest Italian Maestrale-class destroyer was chosen to serve as a prototype for Project 7. Soviet engineers went to Italy, studied the blueprints, observed the ship's construction process, and in 3 years created a general arrangement for a new Soviet production destroyer.
We have two main theaters of naval operations, the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea. Both are closed. This means that we don't have waves, we don't need ocean routes, and we don't need a big range of independent operations. We don't need to cross the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean between San Francisco and the Coral Sea to defeat the Japanese, for example. There were no such objectives. Everything is close, everything is near the shore. This is the reason why Italian projects were so interesting to us. They were also intended for close theaters of operations.
Total displacement, 2,400 tons. Length, 112.5 meters. Beam, more than 10 meters. Draft, about 5 meters. Power plant, 2 main GTZA-24 turbines and 3 water tube boilers. Power, 54,000 brake horsepower. Artillery armament, 4 B-13-2S gun mounts. Caliber, 130 millimeters. Anti-aircraft armament, 2 34K anti-aircraft guns. Caliber, 76 millimeters. 4 70K automatic anti-aircraft guns. Caliber, 37 millimeters. 2 DSHK machine guns. Caliber, 12.7 millimeters. 2 coaxial Colt Browning machine guns of the same caliber. Torpedo armament, 2 triple torpedo launchers, 39U. Anti-submarine armament, 2 depth charge throwers BMB-1, 67 big and small B-1 and M-1 depth charges. Mine armament, from 60 to 95 mines. Maximum speed, 37 knots. cruising range, 1,447 nautical miles. The construction of new destroyers was in full swing when an accident that happened some 4,000 kilometers away from Soviet borders almost put an end to Project 7.
An English destroyer had a very serious accident. She hit a mine. It transpired that the linear layout of the power generating machines, consisting of one boiler room and one engine room, resulted in the ship being dead in the water.
This story discouraged the Soviet leaders. We are building destroyers that would sink after hitting a single mine? This cannot be tolerated. Our industry is not that strong, and we don't have enough money to lose enormous sums when our destroyers can't withstand a mine explosion.
Comrade Stalin ordered that the issue be looked into. And at the time, 1937, repression was at its peak. The verdict was sabotage. Those who worked on the project were charged. 3 engineers were sent to prison.
The project was on the brink of cancellation. 14 destroyers that had already been launched were to be redone, and the rest dismantled on the stocks. However, regardless of the threat of repression, designers of the Sevens managed to defend their project. A decision was made to finish 28 destroyers according to Project 7, while the following 18 ships were laid down according to a new and improved design named Project 7U.
The main difference between Project 7U and Project 7 is increased survivability. This was achieved by installing 4 boilers instead of 3. Even if 2 boilers were disabled, it wouldn't be catastrophic for a destroyer. She could continue to maneuver even with a single boiler working. And that's all. Speed, maneuverability, artillery armament, torpedoes, torpedo and mine armament were the same. This was the main difference.
When designing Project 7 and 7U destroyers, engineers put emphasis on mine and torpedo armament and artillery. Soviet 533mm torpedoes corresponded to those installed on ships from other countries, while her mines were some of the best in the world for the time. As for primary guns, engineers initially planned to arm the Sevens with the so-called cruiser set, comprised of 130mm guns.
They created an excellent primary gun, which was outstanding for that time. It had a diameter of 130 millimeters and a barrel length of 6.5 meters. It turned out that the destroyer was the most powerful in terms of artillery armament until the American Fletcher class arrived.
World War II revealed the main shortcoming of the Seven's anti-aircraft armament. When the destroyers were being designed, aircraft wasn't considered a serious threat.
That's why the anti-aircraft armament of the Sevens was very weak. 2 semi-automatic 45mm K-21 anti-aircraft cannons, 2 DSHK machine guns, and that's it. The arrival of dive bombers made this shortcoming obvious, especially the German Junker Ju-87. This was an absolutely unique machine. They could drop a bomb directly into a large ship's smokestack to get past the armor. You can imagine the scope of devastation caused by a bomb that enters through the smokestack.
Due to the danger from above, the destroyers were augmented with a 37mm anti-aircraft gun. It had one major shortcoming. After about 100 of shots, its barrel would overheat and need to be replaced, often right in the middle of a battle. However, in general, the gun brought good results in battle. After the Navy began installing this type of gun on ships, and on the Sevens in particular, their anti-aircraft armament was considerably improved, and they were now ready to protect the country's sea borders. By the beginning of World War II, 28 Project 7 and 18 Project 7U destroyers were built. The ships arrived just in time and were on a par with those of their potential opponent, Germany.
The latest German destroyers boasted an extra gun. They carried 5 primary guns. They had approximately the same speed and a displacement that was about 500 tons greater, but they were equipped with an unreliable power plant. It had been designed to work best at maximum speed. As a result, the fuel consumption was much higher, which led to a reduction in the cruising range for German destroyers.
When the war began, the Sevens became the backbone of the Soviet fleet in all theaters of naval operations. In the Black Sea, they fought through to Sevastopol and Odessa to deliver ammunition and evacuate the wounded. In the Baltic Sea, they defended Leningrad, and in northern seas, they protected Allied convoys that supplied equipment and ammunition to the USSR. These ships were getting blown up by mines and directly hit by bombs and artillery shells, but then, after being repaired at docks, returning to the seas. 10 out of 28 Sevens and half of the Project 7U destroyers perished during World War II, but earned true military glory.
Let's take the Project 7 Guard destroyer Soobrazitelny, for example. During the war, the 4 years of war, she participated in numerous shore bombardments, troop landings, anti-aircraft and anti-submarine defense operations, and lost only 5 men of her crew throughout the entire war. Even then, they were lost when one of the boilers exploded after a serious malfunction. This means she had no battle casualties at all. Can you imagine this kind of survivability? 4 years of war and constant battles, and only 5 non-battle casualties. That's how good Project 7U was.
During war, it's not uncommon for a battle of local importance to become a milestone in the history of the entire war. The battle near Kanin Nos on September the 18th, 1942 was one of those battles.
Why this routine battle? It was just another day for the Northern Fleet. Nothing out of the ordinary. But why did Kanin Nos go down in history? Why do people talk about it so much? The thing is, in the summer of 1942, a tragedy took place. Convoy PQ-17 was destroyed. Under these circumstances, the British government and Churchill especially were convinced that supply convoys had to be temporarily suspended because it was too dangerous to send them out. In the summer and autumn of 1942, we desperately needed every gun, every aircraft, and every liter of fuel that Allies were bringing to us. Finally, in autumn, we were able to persuade our Western allies, Britain in particular, to renew supplies and to organize Convoy PQ-18. The whole world, every military and political leader of the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and the USA were following the fate of this convoy. Will it be able to reach Soviet shores? Finally, the convoy set off.
For the first half of the trip, the convoy sailed under the protection of Allied forces and lost 11 ships. Then, Soviet ships took over. 2 Project 7 destroyers, Gremyashi and Sokrushitelny, were among them. Near Cape Kanin Nos, the Germans organized a powerful combined attack on the convoy with aircraft and submarines. Torpedo bombers were the first to hit the convoy. A total of 24 Heinkel HE-111 aircraft made 2 raids. Then came the dive bombers. 60 Junkers planes attacked the Allied ships. German aircraft were met with powerful coordinated anti-aircraft fire from the patrol ships. Primary armament guns were firing time delay grenades into the water, taking the necessary target lead. Low-flying HE-111s, caught in the columns of water produced by the explosions, were falling apart or getting hit by shrapnel from exploding shells. The Germans lost 15 aircraft in the battle. 1 transport ship was hit by torpedoes. It was the only loss that the convoy suffered, while under the protection of the USSR's Northern Fleet.
It was difficult to fight off 60 Ju-88s, several submarine attacks, and that constant howling. It's really difficult to explain now. To understand how hard it was for the sailors, you need... Firstly, it was September, cold, but at the same time hot in the heat of battle. The constant howling of aircraft, water splashes, incredible tension. Aircraft attacking from all directions, and then there are incoming torpedoes, from the air, from submarines. Approximately 2.5 hours of this unbelievable tension. It's really hard to understand how difficult it was, even on a psychological level. But they endured this battle, protected the convoy, and proved that the northern route is passable, though dangerous. That's why Cain and Nos went down in history. This battle proved that Arctic convoys were necessary and must continue, and they were renewed.
After the war, destroyers, battered by fights and sea cruises, were sent for major repairs one by one, and in the 1950s, they were gradually decommissioned. Today, only 3 of the legendary Sevens exist, those given to the People's Republic of China. Rekordny is one of these ships. All her life, she served in the Pacific Ocean. In 1952, the destroyer underwent major repairs, was modernized several times, and remained in service until the end of the 1980s.
What does this tell us? Of course, she was modernized, improved. This just means that it was a good project from the very beginning. The hull framework and layout were that good that the ship could endure and serve for more than 50 years. It says a lot about the quality of the project.
Project 7 and 7U destroyers turned out to be timely and effective ships. They had powerful artillery, excellent torpedoes, and decent speed. These were the Sevens that took the Soviet Navy to a completely new level, becoming the backbone of the naval forces throughout the hard years of World War II, and their names became legends. You can activate your bonus code up to April 27th. Don't panic, stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe, as there are more bonus codes to come. Have a lovely time, fair winds and following seas. They were designed to be the best. They met enemies face to face, endured tragedies and enjoyed victories. They went down in history due to the bravery of their crews. They are the ships that deserve to be called naval legends. In this episode, watch Yamato, life and death of a legendary battleship. By spring 1945, it became clear that only a miracle could save Japan from defeat in World War II. The land of the rising sun had lost virtually all its naval and air forces, and US troops were already landing on the Japanese islands. On the morning of April 6, Japan's legendary battleship Yamato sailed off to fight her last battle. The last bit of hope the Japanese possessed rested with this steel giant, the largest and most powerful battleship of the time.
That naval operation in the Pacific, dubbed Tenichi-go, Heaven Won, was a dangerous mission, but the faith in Yamato was almost religious, and the Japanese believed luck would go hand in hand with the ship.
The history of battleship Yamato began 10 years before the ship's legendary last mission. In October 1935, Japanese engineers put together a first draft of the famous naval giant. Unlike the Americans, whose ships were limited to a size that could pass through the Panama Canal, nothing restricted the Japanese from building ships of a large size and displacement and arming them as heavily as possible. Japanese designers set out to make battleships powerful enough to outmatch all existing foreign counterparts and any ships that would be built in the upcoming years.
The production facilities behind me were the Kure Naval Arsenal in those days. Its dockyard saw the birth of battleship Yamato. Her keel was laid in 1937 and the ship was completed in 1941. Yamato was the heaviest battleship in the world. Back then, the total construction expenses amounted to 130 million yen. That would be over 1 trillion yen, $8 billion in today's prices.
Initially, Japan planned to build a total of 4 Yamato-class ships. However, the Pacific War began, and after completing the second ship, Musashi, Japan stopped building the third ship, Shinano, and never started the fourth one. Eventually, Shinano was converted to an aircraft carrier.
Yamato is the ancient name for Japan, meaning great harmony. Strict secrecy was maintained throughout her construction. A high fence of mats surrounded the dockyard. All engineers swore a solemn oath of non-disclosure, and the workers going in and out were compared with their photos. Japanese shipbuilders certainly had something big to hide. Total displacement, 72,808 tons. Length, 263 meters. Beam, 38.9 meters. Draft, over 10 meters. Armament, main battery. 3 turrets, each having 40 SK Mod 94 guns. Caliber, 460 millimeters. Secondary battery. 2 turrets, each having 3 Type 3 guns. Caliber, 155 millimeters. Anti-aircraft artillery, 12 coaxial Type 89 guns. Caliber, 127 millimeters. 50 triple barrel and 2 single barrel Type 96 automatic cannons. Caliber, 25 millimeters. Air group, 7 seaplanes, reconnaissance planes and spotting aircraft. Armor. Main belt, 270 to 410 millimeters. Main turrets, 190 to 650 millimeters. Conning tower, 300 to 500 millimeters. Power plant, 4 Campon turbines and 12 Campon RO boilers. Power, 154,000 shaft horsepower. Maximum speed over 27 knots. Operational range 7,200 nautical miles at 16 knots.
Yamato's key features are her main turrets, each having 3 460mm guns. The guns could fire shells weighing almost 1.5 tons with a muzzle speed of 790 meters per second. A gun turret, including the barbette, weighed 3,000 tons. It could contain over 150 men.
Yamato's main turrets were guided by a fire control system consisting of a director that provided parameters of fire, rangefinders, and electromechanical calculators, a form of early computers. It was a state-of-the-art system for the time. Lack of fire control radars for engaging surface targets was compensated for by top-notch grouping of salvos. This gave the Japanese firing capability on par with that of the world's leading navies. The ship's secondary battery consisted of 2 turrets, each having 3 155mm guns. The guns featured excellent ballistic characteristics and could penetrate the armor of a typical cruiser. However, their rate of fire was pretty low. When commissioned, Yamato had 6 coaxial 127mm anti-aircraft guns for long-range engagement, plus short-range anti-aircraft artillery consisted of 8 triple-barrel 25mm cannons. The number of the AA guns was constantly built up during the war.
The 127mm anti-aircraft guns and the 25mm guns had different ranges of fire. So if an enemy aircraft flew into this gap, neither of the guns was able to effectively intercept it. Furthermore, the 127mm guns had relatively low traverse speed and poor elevation and depression characteristics. They also failed to fire at the declared rate of 14 rounds per minute if the elevation was high or low.
Yamato enjoyed the heaviest armor in shipbuilding history. Its US analog, battleship Iowa, had armor that was on average 100mm thinner. The armor belt of the Japanese Giant formed a citadel that covered slightly over half of her waterline length. The most protected part was the ship's conning tower.
The weapon systems became literally giant. The Japanese built a super battleship that was like 10 or 15 others put together. But the problem was that it did not pay off. You can build one Yamato-class battleship, but she would still be destroyed when facing 2, 3, or 10 US battleships. There are still such characteristics as mobility, quantity, quality, salvos per side.
Yamato was commissioned in late 1941. In her first mission, the Battle of Midway, Yamato served as the flagship of the Japanese combined fleet. During the battle, on June 4 through 6, 1942, Yamato did not fire a single shot and was used only as an HQ ship.
The Japanese military command was definitely saving their 2 best battleships for an upcoming major battle against the US fleet. As a result, Japanese seamen started to feel disappointed with their flagship. They even made up a saying that the world's 3 most useless things were China's Great Wall, the Egyptian pyramids, and the battleship Yamato.
It was not until autumn 1944 that the Japanese naval giant fought its first real battle. Together with her sister ship Musashi, Yamato attacked US landing craft near the island of Leyte. In that battle, Yamato was only slightly damaged, demonstrated her power, and recovered the status of an unsinkable giant. However, the situation in the Pacific theater had changed by that time.
Progress in military technology basically follows the laws of philosophy. When making a new weapon system, designers in the military usually seek to enhance its specifications, bigger caliber, thicker armor, etc. Then they come to a dead end, where they are no longer developing the Navy, but improving a separate weapon type within the existing limits. A radical change is carrier-borne aviation, and later, missile systems. But Yamato is the peak in the construction of battleships. It is not about progress, it is about reaching the peak.
In 1945, World War II reached Japan's home islands. The command of the Japanese combined fleet made a Bushido-style decision. Yamato, with the help of a light cruiser and 8 destroyers, was to defend the island of Okinawa and prevent the US troops from getting any further inland, or fight to the end and finish her journey gloriously. Executing this order on April 6, 1945, the legendary Japanese battleship sailed off to fight her last battle. The United States sent in its Task Force 58 to intercept the flagship of the Japanese combined fleet. The Americans would not miss the chance to destroy the symbol of Japan's naval power. As early as 10 a.m., the first US squadrons took off from 5 heavy and 4 light aircraft carriers, located about 300 miles away from Yamato. A total of 227 aircraft took part in the destruction of the Japanese force. The battle began at 12:34. 4 aerial bombs hit Yamato, taking out a 127mm gun and several automatic cannons. In just 20 minutes, 2 more bombs struck the battleship and a torpedo hit her port side. In response, Yamato fired her anti-aircraft weapons. At 14:02, the Americans launched the last attack on the wounded, but still combat-capable Yamato. It was a demonstrative execution. 4 torpedoes, 3 to the port side and 1 to the starboard side, destroyed the ship's damage control center. Yamato stopped moving and started listing to port more and more every minute. And when this huge ship capsized, a monstrous explosion erupted. The pride and hope of the Japanese fleet went under. Together with the ship, 3,000 crew members were lost, including the commanders of the Japanese force and the ship. For the Japanese, Yamato still remains a symbol of the nation's might that fell in battle like a true samurai. The city where the legendary battleship was built opened a museum, whose centerpiece is a 26-meter model of Yamato.
The Kure Municipal Museum of Naval History and Science was built 10 years ago to preserve the rich naval history of the city. Now it is known as the Yamato Museum. The exhibits reflect the naval history of Kure. In other words, the history of naval affairs and technologies. The museum has become quite popular. Fans of battleships come here from all over the country. However, we should remember that it was originally dedicated to all kinds of shipbuilding.
The violent explosion that finished the destruction of Yamato was caused by the detonation of her main battery magazines. However, there is plenty of debate about the reason for that tremendous explosion. The answer is probably hidden on the bottom of the ocean. So far, researchers have been unable to lift what is left from the giant battleship.
It is true that Yamato had a number of drawbacks. Like her sister ship, Musashi, the battleship was sunk as a result of airstrikes. The key reason for that was the ship's fundamental lack of ability to resist massive air attacks.
Yamato remains the largest and most powerful battleship in history. For every person who takes interest in the history of military ships, Yamato embodies military might. Born to terrify and crush enemies, this formidable steel giant managed to glorify her name even as she was defeated. She represented a pinnacle in large battleship design, one that will probably never be surpassed, and in that sense, Yamato will always remain a symbol and a legend.
Sailors, stay calm.
You can activate your bonus code up to April 27th. Don't panic, stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe, as there are more bonus codes to come. Have a lovely time. Fair winds and following seas.
Of all the weapons used by the warring parties in World War II, a special place is occupied by a gun from a Swiss company, Oerlikon. This autocannon was operated by the militaries on both sides of the front line, but only the Allies managed to reveal its full potential. Using the Swiss-designed weapon, the Allied navies provided their ships with highly effective air defense.
The Oerlikon is a Swiss-designed gun made in the UK under licence, and it was introduced into the Royal Navy in 1940.
Specifications of the Oerlikon anti-aircraft gun. Caliber 20mm, barrel weight with breech block from 64 to 68 kilograms, gun length 2,210mm, ammunition feed, drum magazine holding 45, 60, 75 or 100 rounds. Rate of fire from 250 to 320 rounds per minute. The guns were fitted in single, twin and quadruple mountings.
The gun is used for fast surface targets and for anti-aircraft as well. So the gun was fitted to many naval ships, from aircraft carriers right down to the smallest minesweepers.
In 1941, England commissioned battleship Duke of York with 6 Oerlikon cannons on board. It was the first British warship armed with Swiss anti-aircraft guns. One of the key requirements that the British put forward for Oerlikons was that they be operable and maintainable for unqualified personnel, like fishermen and sailors from the merchant fleet. This condition proved to be quite far-sighted. Before World War II kicked off, Great Britain ordered 1,500 guns from Switzerland and purchased a license for their production. By 1943, single-barrel Oerlikon anti-aircraft guns were no longer effective against fast and well-protected enemy aircraft. A good solution to this problem was the development of multi-gun mounts.
This is a 20mm Oerlikon Mark 11 mounting, fitted with 2 20mm cannons, each capable of firing up to 350 rounds a minute per gun. However, the magazine only holds 60 rounds. So the rate of fire is dependent upon the crew's ability to resupply magazines to the gun throughout the action.
The twin mounts were fed with ammunition from the left and right-hand sides. To avoid mistakes during loading, The magazine for the left gun was painted in a bright colour.
This is the 60-round magazine which fits on the cannon. This one is empty, but it's still very heavy. Imagine it filled with 60 rounds. Fits on the cannon like this and would be changed perhaps 3 or 4 times during an engagement. The loader's job is not just to load the magazine. She has to put the bullets or the shells inside the magazine. Each shell is individually loaded into the magazine, pre-greased to allow for lubrication through the firing system. As you can see, the aimer uses his body weight to move the mounting in a training motion. The elevation is adjusted by the hand wheel you can see here. When he's given the command by the gunnery controller, and once he has got the gun onto the target, he calls aimer target and is given the command to engage. At that point, he takes the safety catch off and fires the weapon.
When a shot is fired, gunpowder gases apply pressure to the projectile, which starts moving out of the barrel, and the cartridge, which pushes the breech, makes it slide along the barrel. The weight of the breech and the return force of the spring, pressed by it, are matched in such a way so that the moment the projectile leaves the barrel, a spent cartridge is ejected from the breech block, and the next round is fed to her place from the magazine. At this moment, the recoil spring pushes the breech back, ramming the shell into the chamber.
There are 2 loaders for this gun, one for the right gun and one for the left. Obviously, they don't just lift full magazines onto the gun and take the empty ones away. Their duties are also to act as the emergency crew. Should anything happen to the aimer, who sits on the left-hand side, then the gun can be fired manually by one person from the back of the gun here.
The guns in the twin mount fire in turn. As a result, its cyclic rate of fire is about 600 rounds per minute. The Oerlikon was used on ships as a short-range anti-aircraft gun. Its effective range of fire was up to 2 kilometers. You can say it was a last-chance weapon, especially for American ships, as they had to face Japanese kamikaze attacks in the Pacific. During the war, Oerlikon autocannons were extensively installed on the ships of the Allies. For example, the American Essex-class aircraft carriers were equipped with up to 50 Oerlikon guns. Therefore, the number of people on board the ships became significantly larger due to the anti-aircraft gun crews.
Remembering that all the crew are actually linked together by the gunnery control communication system, they all can hear the commands from the gunnery director platform and the master gunner. This box relates to the Type 6 gyro sight and is the controlled inputs which are given to him by the gunnery director platform personnel prior to the start of the engagement, and set such things as wind speed, direction and air temperature which affect the ballistics of the ammunition. If, during the engagement, which obviously is very noisy, there is a need to stop firing, the gunnery director officer in the gunnery director platform will press the check fire bell, which operates this bell you see here. And this rings continuously until the aimer replies through his communication system, check, 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 which informs the gunnery officer that he has stopped firing.
During World War II, the Allies produced over 300,000 Oerlikon cannons. Many of them were later modified and upgraded, but in general, they still remained a Swiss design. The gun was too advanced for the time when it was developed in the early 1930s, and only when World War II broke out did this cannon occupy a niche where it was unmatched on both opposing sides. According to US statistics, from December 1941 through September 1944, as many as 32% of all Japanese aircraft were shot down by naval Oerlikon guns. In the second half of 1942, about 48% of enemy aircraft losses resulted from the use of these small caliber cannons. After the war, the 20mm Oerlikon AA gun remained in service with many navies around the globe, until it was inevitably replaced by more advanced systems. However, even today, you can still see the World War II design Oerlikon guns installed on some small patrol ships.
You can activate your bonus code up to April 27th. Don't panic, stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe, as there are more bonus codes to come. Have a lovely time. Fair winds and following seas. In his memoirs dedicated to World War II, Winston Churchill wrote that the only thing that made him worry about Great Britain losing the war to Germany were the German submarines. In the small town Labo in northern Germany, the last surviving Type 7 submarine stands solitary on the beach. It was this submarine type that worried Winston Churchill and posed the most severe threat to shipping in the Atlantic Ocean at the beginning of the 1940s.
The Treaty of Versailles strictly forbade Germany from designing, building, or possessing submarines. All this was forbidden.
Nevertheless, in order to preserve their school of underwater shipbuilding and build upon the experience gained in World War I, a shipbuilding design bureau was registered in 1922 in The Hague, with German engineers as members of its staff. This firm offered many countries the possibility to purchase projects of submarines developed on the basis of the German World War I submarine UB3.
Simultaneously, they were working on the projects of so-called mobilization submarines. The larger submarine was called Type 1, while a submarine with smaller displacement of 500 tons evolved to become the Type 7 project. The idea was that if and when Germany entered a war, all the restrictions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles would naturally become obsolete, and submarines of this type could be built very quickly in large quantities.
The further development of Type 7 submarines and their construction became possible thanks to a naval treaty signed between Germany and Great Britain in 1935. This treaty allowed Germany to have a navy of a total tonnage not greater than 1/3 of that of the British Navy. As for submarines, Germany was given the right to have a fleet equal to the British one.
The important thing was that this submarine was very easy to construct thanks to its design, which allowed for extensive use of welding. Enormous numbers of these boats could be constructed in a relatively short period of time.
Despite the design of Type 7 submarines repeating concepts from World War I, this ship had great potential for further modernization. Thus, subtypes A and B appeared, which differed from each other only in their details. The general concept of a medium submarine with a displacement of 700 tons remain unchanged.
A submarine can only have well-balanced characteristics up to some specific dimensions. If it's a large submarine, it starts to have control issues when underwater. It also has problems with surfacing, submerging, and excess trim differences. All this leads to a reduction in a submarine's overall maneuverability.
Considering that maneuverability is no less important than combat capability, engineers added an important improvement to subtype B, the double vertical rudder. This allowed them to considerably reduce the turning circle radius, which provided certain tactical advantages.
When the mass production of Type 7 submarines began, they received the designation 7C. In this case, there were two subtypes as well, namely 7C41 and C42.
Specifications of submarine U-995 Type 7/41 1943. Length more than 67 meters. Beam more than 6 meters. Mean draft 4.7 meters. Submerged displacement 871 tons. With this modification, the boat's hull was made longer by one frame spacing to accommodate new sonar. It's 60 centimeters. Adding only one frame allowed for a 20-ton increase in the fuel reserves as well, but it had a negative impact on speed. The submarine lost about half a knot from its submerged speed. It's a side tank submarine. Her aft and bow ends, side bulges and deck superstructure with the conning tower's railing were welded to the pressure hull. Maximum diameter of the pressure hull, almost 5 meters. Thickness of the pressure hull, 18.5 to 21.5 millimeters. The submarine's pressure hull is divided into 6 compartments. First, forward torpedo room. Second, forward battery compartment with commanding officers' cabins on the deck. Third, control room with conning tower on top of it. This is where the captain was situated during an attack. The control room was also the shelter compartment. It's surrounded by concave bulkheads that are able to withstand pressure up to 10 atmospheres. This is the pressure found at a depth of about 100 meters. Fourth, living quarters with the galley. The second group of batteries was located in its hold. Fifth, diesel compartment. Sixth, aft torpedo room. 2 electric motors were also installed here. The main ballast went into 5 tanks, 2 at the ends in the outer hull, 2 inside the bulges, and the last one in the pressure hull, under the third compartment's deck. 3 tanks could be used to store fuel. Armament: 5 torpedo launchers, caliber 533 millimeters. Ammunition: 14 torpedoes. The G7E electric torpedo. German submariners nicknamed it the Eel. It's noteworthy that it was developed in 1929. However, the design turned out to be so successful, the various modifications of it were manufactured until 1944. The latest versions of the torpedo were self-guided and equipped with a heating system inside the launcher, which allowed it to travel up to a distance of 7.5 kilometers at a speed of 30 knots. Artillery armament. Initially, these submarines carried the SK C/35 gun with a caliber of 88 millimeters. However, with the changing nature of combat, anti-aircraft armament began to appear on 7s from 1942 onwards. U-995 had the following: Flak M42U cannon, caliber 37 millimeters. 2 Flak 38 autocannons, caliber 20 millimeters. Power plant. 2 diesel engines with a total power of 3,200 horsepower. 2 electric engines, 750 horsepower each. 2 groups of accumulator batteries, 62 elements each. For this modification, the power plant was rearranged to free up 11.5 tons of displacement. This allowed engineers to increase the pressure hull's thickness. As a result, the operating depth increased to 120 meters and the maximum depth reached 300 meters. The boat was equipped with a special system that allowed her diesel engines to work underwater, a snorkel. Maximum surface speed 17 knots. Maximum submerged speed 7.6 knots. Operating range: surfaced 8,500 miles at 10 knots. Submerged 80 miles at 4 knots. Endurance 40 days. Everything was sacrificed to increase the combat capability of the ship. 2 people shared one bunk, and some even slept on torpedoes. All available space was taken up by provisions, and even one of the lavatories wasn't used during the first week of a combat cruise because it was stuffed full of food supplies. To complete the picture, imagine how the air those people breathed was: a mixture of diesel engine exhaust and kitchen smells, spiced with a dense aroma of cologne, which submariners generously applied to themselves as they had no means to bathe properly.
Crews spent a long time in training to perfect all the maneuvers on their submarines. A large number of torpedoes were provided for training. Generally, they made tens of torpedo launches under varying conditions. That's why when a submarine sailed out on a combat patrol, it was business as usual for them. They had already carried out all the potential operations multiple times and could perform their tasks automatically. This allowed them to achieve great results.
This bunk is somewhat bigger than the rest, obviously. It's where the captain would sleep. It's unclear if he ever managed to get a good night's sleep, because even when he was resting, he was aware of all the events happening inside and outside the boat. The radio and sonar room are just opposite his cabin. When the situation required his urgent presence in the control room, the captain only needed to take a couple of steps to get there. This is the horizontal rudder control station. The rudders were driven electrically, but there was a backup hydraulic system in place. When the order to submerge was given, the operators would set the rudders to the necessary position. These valves controlled the main ballast. They would be opened gradually as the submarine reached a certain difference, which was controlled with the help of this device. Quite often, an unusual trick was used to speed up the submergence. All the off-duty crew members at that moment would quickly run into the bow compartment. All these actions were perfected during training, so in a battle, a well-prepared crew could bring their submarine from the surface position to a depth of 10 meters in 25 to 27 seconds. This was considered the best result in the world at that time.
Auf einen bewaffneten Frachter gestoßen. Alarm! Auf Seerohrtiefe!
In the summer of 1939, German leadership formulated the main strategic objective for the German Navy: the destruction of British merchant shipping. Torpedo-armed submarines were the best candidates to do this, and the more numerous they were, the sooner this objective would be completed. On September 3, U-30 sank British liner SS Athenia. Thus began World War II at sea. The liner's torpedoing gave a certain reputation to Type 7 submarines and to the entire German underwater fleet. The Allies began to arm civilian ships with artillery to fight against submarines. In response, Germany declared unrestricted submarine warfare and started the mass production of submarines. Torpedo launchers on Sevens were not very different from their analogues used by the navies of other countries. However, they had a number of interesting features. For example, torpedoes were pushed out with the help of a pneumatic piston, which gave the advantage of a bubble-free torpedo launch. A torpedo could also be programmed with the necessary course, speed and depth without taking it out of the tube. This was done with the help of a mechanical system connecting to external sockets on a torpedo. The required parameters could be set both here and from the central control room. Type 7 submarines were easy to control, reliable, cheap to build, and had a good balance of combat and operational qualities. Although by their design features, these boats weren't meant for prolonged combat use, their unique characteristics, such as dive speed and maximum submergence depth, made them practically invulnerable. So, by the beginning of World War II, the German Navy had at their disposal arguably the best weapon to wage underwater war, as well as perfectly trained crews, and only one person knew how to use them to achieve maximum results.
Karl Dönitz was an experienced submarine commander. During World War I, he carried out many successful operations in the Mediterranean. From the very beginning, in 1935, he made a significant impact on the development of the German underwater fleet. He developed the tactics that would later be used by submarines, including the so-called Wolfpack tactic.
Each submarine was assigned a position, and the entire group formed a line that crossed the expected route of a convoy. The width of this curtain and the distance between submarines resulted in a high probability of the discovery of a passing convoy by at least one boat. The data on the location and of course of a convoy could also be obtained by radio reconnaissance or aviation. All the information was gathered by an operations center on the shore, which coordinated the actions of the group and sent all nearby submarines to attack a convoy. Once a submarine discovered a convoy, she would send its position to the center and continue tracking the target, staying at a safe distance from it.
In the night, she would make a dash towards the convoy, surface and deliver a torpedo strike. During this, she remained invisible. The visibility is very poor at night, so you would need to search for her, need to discover her. Unlike destroyers, after an attack, she didn't need to retreat. She just dived and that's it, you couldn't see her. She then moved to another position to deliver another strike, and as there would be many submarines and they all attacked almost simultaneously, it caused the convoy's escort ships to spread out. So they would attack one submarine and another appeared. Chasing the second submarine, a third one would emerge. Like this, subs got closer and closer to the convoy, which remained virtually defenseless, and this all resulted in a very serious loss of tonnage. It meant that you could quickly and efficiently destroy convoys.
On October 17, 1940, U-boat U-38 discovered the SC-7 convoy. The sub sent the convoy's coordinates to Dönitz's headquarters in Lorient. They were immediately forwarded to all the submarines patrolling that area. Throughout the following day, gathering submarines attacked 3 ships from the convoy. At the same time, the only escort ship, British HMS Scarborough, was reinforced with sloops, HMS Fowey and HMS Leith, and corvettes HMS Bluebell and HMS Heartsease. By the end of the day, 7 submarines shadowed the convoy. The night of October 18 to 19 was ideal for underwater predators, with a full moon and calm sea. Around 2100, U-46 fired 4 torpedoes at cargo ships Convallaria and Beatus. HMS Leith rushed to find the attacking submarine. Driving the boat off, the ship sailed several miles away from the convoy. At this moment, U-101 torpedoed transport Kreekirk. The vessel, loaded with iron ore, quickly sank. Closer to 2200, U-99, commanded by Otto Kretschmer, fired her first torpedo salvo. SS Empire Minerva steamed at full speed, but it didn't save her. One of Kretschmer's torpedoes struck her engine room, and the vessel lost propulsion and started to sink quickly. Escort ships rushed about among the spreading cargo ships, trying to get them together. Meanwhile, U-99 made its way to the formation center and struck the convoy ship at point-blank range without even aiming. Here's how Kretschmer described those events in his battle log. 22:30. Firing from the forward launcher at a heavily loaded transport, the torpedo misses but hits another, even larger ship of about 7,000 tons. The vessel sinks bow first. 23:55. Launching a torpedo at a large dry cargo ship. A hit. Her bow section is destroyed up to her bridge. 00:15. I'm constantly hearing the explosions of torpedoes launched by our submarines. Destroyers rush about and fire star shells explode from time to time, but to no purpose. 01:38. Firing from the forward launcher. A hit. The vessel sinks. 01:55. Firing. A hit. The ship sinks in 40 seconds. Around midnight, cargo ship Assyrian, with the convoy's commodore on board, spotted a German submarine directly in front of them, some 90 meters away. In an attempt to ram the enemy boat, the steamer engaged full speed ahead, but soon found herself far from the convoy and without any defenses. At 1:22, the vessel was torpedoed by U-101. At around 5:00 in the morning, U-123 used her artillery to finish off transport Clintonia, which has been abandoned by her crew. The gunners got so excited that they almost fired at Kretschmer's U-99 that happened to be nearby. At sunrise, the submarines left, having sunk 20 and damaged 6 of 30 cargo ships. The following night, convoy HX-79 sailed through that same area. It consisted of 49 transports and 12 escort ships. Despite quite strong defenses, 5 German submarines managed to sink 12 vessels from the caravan in the course of several hours. As a result, in 3 days, the Germans had routed 2 Allied convoys without losing a single submarine. In historical literature dedicated to the operations of German U-boats, the period from summer of 1940 through the end of spring 1942 is often called Happy Times. Then, Dönitz's Lions, as the German propaganda called submariners, were the only masters of the Atlantic. 1942 was the year of the greatest triumph for the Sevens. German submarines managed to sink more than 2 million tons of Allied shipping that year. At that time, the Kriegsmarine had 330 Type 7 U-boats, while it had entered the war with only 57 of them. German shipbuilders launched a new 7 every 2 days. Nevertheless, in 1943, the Allies began to gradually press Dönitz's Lions at sea, bringing their defeat closer.
A special anti-submarine command for the Atlantic Ocean was created under Admiral King. It dealt only with anti-submarine warfare without any distractions. That was the organizational side. There was a technical side as well. Allied fleets started to receive large numbers of anti-submarine ships. They were armed with compact sonar, anti-submarine mortars, and hydroacoustic stations. All these allowed each individual ship to discover submarines, chase them down on the basis of their own data, and deliver strikes quicker and with more precision, so that the German submarines simply didn't have time to evade them.
Defeat in the underwater war wasn't a sudden event, but rather a gradual development. However, it all happened in quite a short period of time. All these measures bore great results. In May 1943, the Allies sank more German submarines in one day than the transports they had managed to torpedo.
Between 1935 and 1945, 709 Type 7 submarines were built. 546 of them were lost in combat operations, and 65 were scuttled by their own crews at the end of the war. The fate of the surviving submarines was decided by the Allies at the Potsdam Conference. From November 1945 through January 1946, near Scotland, Operation Deadlight was carried out. In its course, more than 100 German submarines were destroyed, either with explosive charges or by artillery fire from destroyers HMS Onslow and Bliscavita. 83 of them were Type 7 U-boats. Several surviving ships entered the fleets of the victorious countries and their allies. U-995 served in the Kriegsmarine a little more than 6 months and was in the Northern Sea when the war ended. In May 1945, the sub surrendered to Norway and served in the Norwegian Navy for the following 15 years. With the commissioning of new submarine types, U-995 lost its value as a combat unit, and the Norwegians transferred the 7 to Germany to become a museum ship.
The Type 7 program was one of the most successful German submarine building programs, especially when you think of their quantity. It's arguably one of the most numerous ship types in the world by the number of units built. I believe that even the Liberty-class ships were less numerous.
Type 7 submarines are quite controversial. Some say that they were the best ships of their type. Others simply call the 7 a steel coffin. Undoubtedly, these submarines were very effective, but as history proved, the development of anti-submarine warfare didn't leave them a single chance of winning. The 7s can be compared to a sword. It was a threatening and effective weapon in skillful hands until the introduction of gunpowder.
Sailors, stay calm.
You can activate your bonus code up to April 27th. Don't panic, stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe, as there are more bonus codes to come. Have a lovely time. Fair winds and following seas.
They were designed to be the best. They met enemies face to face, endured tragedies and enjoyed victories. They went down in history due to the bravery of their crews. They are the ships that deserve to be called naval legends. In this episode, the invulnerable Hornet. While the Pacific Campaign was in full swing, the US Navy started receiving new Essex-class heavy aircraft carriers. They became the long-awaited reinforcements that helped the Americans crush the Japanese Imperial fleet. One of the most famous ships of this class, CV-12 Hornet, inherited her name from another aircraft carrier that distinguished herself at the start of the war. In April 1942, 4 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Americans prepared a bold and daring operation. 16 ground-based B-25 Army bombers had been brought aboard aircraft carrier CV-8 Hornet, which sailed towards the Japanese islands.
That was to let the Japanese know that you bomb our homeland, you come close to our homeland, we'll come to you. They literally sent the B-25s off of an aircraft carrier, something that had never been done before, and it was a one-way mission. They didn't have enough fuel to get back.
The Doolittle raid inspired Americans and strengthened their belief in victory over Japan. In September 1942, CV-8 Hornet received serious damage during the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands and sank. However, its famous name was given to a new aircraft carrier, CV-12, that was under construction at the Newport News shipyard.
The keel was laid in 1942, and a year and a month later, in 1943, the ship was underway. A remarkable production in 1 year, especially when you realize it was done without computers, just slide rules and blueprints. 24 of these ships were produced during the Second World War. You know, it's amazing to consider that.
General performance capabilities of USS Hornet. Total displacement up to 36,000 tons. Length up to 266 meters. Beam 45 meters. Draft at full load 9.1 meters. Armament 59 Oerlikon cannons. Caliber 20 millimeters. 10 quadruple Mark II Bofors guns. Caliber 40 millimeters. 12 Mark 12 dual-purpose guns. Caliber 127 millimeters. Armor, main belt and beam bulkheads 102 millimeters. Hangar deck 64 millimeters. The air group consisted of 4 squadrons with up to 103 aircraft in total. Hellcat fighters, Helldiver dive bombers, Avenger torpedo bombers. Maximum speed up to 33 knots. Cruising range 15,000 miles.
So, an aircraft carrier is a heavy attack ship. It's a floating airfield, but at the same time, the aircraft carrier itself becomes a main target for enemy attacks. It became clear, to prevail at sea, one must destroy aircraft carriers. Accordingly, in addition to every aircraft carrier being heavily armed with anti-aircraft defenses, they were covered by Allied ships. For example, USS Hornet had up to 60 guns of various anti-aircraft artillery aboard.
All anti-aircraft weapons on board. All of our weapons were devoted to anti-aircraft. The single-barrel guns could put between 6 and 10 rounds of explosive anti-aircraft shells in the air per minute. So you multiply that times 12, that's a lot of shells in the air. We could put up a lead curtain that kept most of the attacking aircraft away. The closest a kamikaze fighter ever got was cartwheeling over the deck into the water and never hit us with a bomb or the aircraft itself.
But even with this colossal number of guns, the main anti-aircraft weapon of an aircraft carrier is its fighter aviation.
The striking force of an aircraft carrier consisted of bombers and torpedo bombers, whose range was many times greater than that of the artillery of modern battleships of the time.
The very first aircraft carriers built after World War I showed that no matter how powerful booster engines were on planes, the flight deck was too short for them to gain the necessary speed. Then the idea appeared that aircraft should have an additional method for acceleration.
Now, they can't do it by themselves. They have to have assistance through the catapult system. This cable, it's hooked up underneath the wing, goes down, wraps around the front of that shuttle down below, and that shuttle runs in this track out to the front of the ship. There's a hydraulic engine rammed way down below that is powering this thing. And at that point, the plane is doing about 120 to 130 knots. It's a rather exciting start.
Right after takeoff, pilots had exhausting work to do. The tension was growing with every mile of flight, and when they arrived at the target area, it would become immense.
The pilots were aware of the risks they took in flying over the enemy territory and in combat there. And then as they got back to the ship, they'd tend to relax because now they feel safe. But they should always remember that one of the most challenging and dangerous things they're going to do is land back aboard this ship.
An aircraft has a very high speed when landing. If it attempts to land by itself, it will just roll along the deck and fall off the other edge. That's why the question arose, how do we stop this?
This area, and there's 4 of these on either side of the deck where the cables would stretch out, and down below decks there's a bunch of equipment they're being tensioned, and they know how much the plane weighs that's coming in, so they actually tension the wire for the weight of that plane. And so as it comes in, they grab the hook and they will stop before they get to the end of this angled deck here, which is only another couple hundred feet beyond this touchdown area. Once they touch down and stop, they retract their hook, the cable is retracted, it's set for the next plane. It's often only 30 seconds between aircraft landing.
Some airplanes were much easier to land on board than others. And the particular airplane that I flew, the F-8 Crusader, was a difficult airplane to land. Ship that we're landing on is moving through the water, and we don't always have calm seas or good visibility and such as that. So it was necessary to land sometimes at night. Maybe we're in rough seas and the whole deck is heaving and swaying. If the ship has to go faster to accommodate the landings on the ship, very often stack gas that comes out of the stacks drift across the landing area, and it interrupts your smooth flight on board to the ship.
There was a peculiarity during World War II. When landing on a deck, pilots had to drop all ammunition remaining after an attack down into the sea. Why? Because the accident rate was high. Pilots were landing by themselves, after all. There wasn't any guidance, radio navigation, nothing at all. They had to do it all by themselves. They were tired and exhausted. If the worst happened and an aircraft crash landed, its whole ammunition stock would explode.
It's a very precise maneuver to land on these, and any interruption of that can result, of course, in a crash or a near crash. It's a point of pride that we were able to do that and do it consistently well.
This ship went through something around 200,000 landings before it was decommissioned. So it's a round-the-clock process, round the clock.
I lived on board ships like this for a total of 29 months, so I'm intimately familiar with the flight deck of the aircraft carrier.
The Hornet aircraft carrier was commissioned in 1943. The United States had the advantage in the Pacific theater of operations by that time, but their enemy was still extremely dangerous. A raid by a carrier task force could be compared to a royal hunt. The Queen is escorted by several dozen ships of different types, from fuel transports to battleships. Crews are at battle stations. Scouts are sweeping hundreds of square miles of ocean looking for prey.
My favorite room on the Hornet, this is Combat Information Center. In this room, all of the sensors for the Hornet come into this room. All of the radars, sonar information, electronic warfare information, it's all flowing into this room, and they're figuring out what needs to be filtered out and acted upon and passed up to the bridge for action.
A scouting report comes in. The enemy was detected. That's it. The flag officer gives the order to attack. What does that involve? Launching an aircraft or a group of aircraft from a carrier? It all starts from the top, the speed and direction of the wind.
We're now in the aerology office, otherwise known as the weather office for the ship. And there was a crew here 24 hours a day keeping an eye on the weather. Big thing for an aircraft carrier is how fast is the wind. So they're constantly monitoring that. They're even sending off weather balloons from them just outside this office to keep track of some of the upper atmospheric conditions that are going on.
The commanding officer of the task force, the flag officer, Admiral, gives the order. Prepare for takeoff. The flagship navigator calculates the course necessary for aircraft to take off. The aircraft carrier turns around. Accordingly, the whole formation turns around.
And that's basically controlled by two enlisted men right here at these stations. Obviously, this is the wheel, and this is the ship's steering wheel. And what's going on is the operator is watching his compass, his gyro compass repeater. He's getting orders from one of the officers out there in the bridge to steer a certain course.
The ships have turned around, then the work on the flight deck starts. The deck gets cleaned, they remove all debris, bolts, dirt, and garbage. Maybe there's some ice or dew, they get removed too. Then comes the hangar service unit. Elevators come up, aircraft get rolled out, and at the same time, the oil and lubricants unit starts to bring fuel hoses and tanks to the upper deck. And all these people, about 2,000 crewmen, just to make it possible for 10 aircraft to take off. Take off. Everything works. Everything flies. It's a very complex procedure. And by 1943, the Americans mastered it. As the saying goes, they knew it like the back of their hand.
However, not one of the carrier's crew indulged in illusions. Everyone understood that experience, discipline, and excellent organization might not be enough to protect against an enemy torpedo or bomb.
The last room I wanted to show you was all the way here in the back. And it actually required another combination to get into. You had to have top secret clearance to get into this room. Now, it sounds exciting. The information that's being printed on these teletype machines is classified top secret. It's a warship. If the ship got hit, it's being sunk, you're in enemy territory. You would take the most important security things, put them in the bags, which are weighted very heavy at the bottom with a steel plate, and then you head outside and toss it over into the ocean, and it'll sink, and hopefully the other guys don't get it then.
The attack on Pearl Harbor showed the high efficiency of aircraft carriers. In accordance with the traditions of Eastern philosophy, Americans learned the lesson that the enemy had taught them and started beating the Japanese at their own game. Every day, commanding officers of task forces resolved issues and set in motion enormous amounts of resources without realizing that they lay the foundations of new naval warfare tactics.
In general, we're talking about Essex-class carriers. Hornet is one of them. They are attack ships. An operation is carried out, ammunition and fuel are used up. The next operation won't start until these ships return to base and get more fuel, ammunition, food and water, as well as new aircraft and new pilots. We are preparing a new general engagement, while the Americans are. When? The day those aircraft and aircraft carriers are ready. The day when the Hornet is ready.
Having participated in dozens of battles, Hornet had to pass the final exam. In the face of inevitable defeat, the Japanese Fleet Command decided to go all in. Battleship Yamato was sent to stop the Americans. April 7, 1945 became a day to remember for Hornet and 7 other U.S. aircraft carriers.
Task Force 58 was huge. It consisted of 5 heavy and 3 light aircraft carriers. Imagine 227 aircraft of the attack wave taking off. 227 aircraft attacking. Everyone found their positions in their air groups. This whole wave arrived at the target. Orders were coming from ships. From the flagship, the aircraft attacked. They attacked from different directions simultaneously. The Japanese couldn't do anything about it. Battleship Yamato was defenseless against such a well-organized air attack. The strike was delivered, the ship was destroyed, the aircraft flew back. One by one, they left their formation, found their aircraft carrier, landed, and all this without hindering other pilots. The destruction of Yamato was the pinnacle of the U.S. Navy's airstrike organization.
This operation put an end to the Japanese Imperial fleet. Several months later, the empire itself fell as well.
We were at Hunters Point Naval Shipyard and just finished our sea trials, sea readiness trials, and World War II ended. We became the lead ship in Operation Magic Carpet. This is how we got our guys home from over there. We didn't have any way to fly them home, so all naval ships were pressed into service. What they did is they welded 3,000 bunks to the hangar deck of all the aircraft carriers, Hornet being the first. It's a 9-day trip from the Pacific Theater back to Pearl Harbor, where we took our guys. We were luxury accommodations. We did have a visitor some years ago who was aboard during that time. And he told us the story of it. And the story was, you got 1 meal a day. You were either in your bed, in a line to go to the bathroom, or a line to get chow. That was it. That was your routine for 9 days. And that was the entire ship's crew as well, in addition to doing their jobs. But the passengers particularly, they were happy to be going home, but they were fairly bored on the way home.
The Hornet's biography is the history of the Pacific War. She took part in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and the attack on Yamato in April 1945. Today, the aircraft carrier is one of the most popular attractions in California and a reminder of the heroic past of the U.S. Navy.
She had an enviable record, one of the best records in World War II. She fought in 59 battles and was never hit by a bomb, never hit by a torpedo, never hit by a kamikaze. During all that time, she was considered one of the luckiest ships in the Navy.
Sailors, stay calm.
You can activate your bonus code up to April 27th. Don't panic, stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe, as there are more bonus codes to come. Have a lovely time. Fair winds and following seas.
Severomorsk. At the beginning of the 20th century, it was home to about 13 families of huntsmen and fishermen. Today it houses the main base of the Russian Federation's Northern Fleet. And it's not easy to get permission to visit. But we haven't come to one of the most secret cities in Russia just out of mere curiosity. I'm here to tell you about the K-21 submarine. In the spring of 1942, command of this ship was entrusted to Captain Third Rank Nikolai Lunin. This was the beginning of one of the most vivid pages in the history of the Russian Navy.
The Soviet K-class submarines, nicknamed Katyusha by sailors, were created thanks to efforts of Mikhail Rudnitsky, the chief of the submarine department at the Institute of Naval Shipbuilding. At the beginning of 1935, he presented his own project of a cruiser and fleet submarine to the USSR Naval Command. The specifications of this submarine were so promising that even before the final technical project had been approved, the decision was made to construct a large series of ships of this class. The author of the project, which was sometimes nicknamed Rudnitsky's Cruiser in his honor, managed to create a ship with very extensive and varied combat capabilities that were a perfect match for the Soviet naval doctrine of that time.
It was supposed that, in order to perform the tasks of a fleet submarine, she would stay within a specified area and patrol it. If an enemy appeared, she would let the main Allied forces know about it. Then, using her advantageous situation, she would be able to deploy mines in the path of the advancing enemy fleet. After the hostiles suffered some losses in this minefield, the sub would carry out a torpedo attack. After this, she would disengage and wait for the enemy to sail away from the quadrant. Thanks to her higher speed, she would then move to another position and re-engage the hostiles there. That's the action algorithm of a fleet submarine.
Simultaneously, large submarines were to carry out cruiser missions, acting on sea communications in remote areas, far from home bases and shores. The technical project of a cruiser and fleet submarine was developed and improved for a further 2 years. In December 1936, the first 3 ships were laid down in Leningrad. This series of submarines received the number 14. In the Navy, they were designated as the K-class. Specifications of K-class submarines. Length 97.6 meters. Beam almost 7.5 meters. Mean draft 4 meters. Submerged displacement 2,104 tons. The boat has a double hull. Maximum diameter of the pressure hull 5.3 meters. Thickness of the pressure hull 18 to 22 millimeters. The submarine is divided into 7 compartments. The first and 7th, torpedo compartments with crew berths. The second, bow battery compartment. The officers' mess hall and 5 single cabins for the commanding officers were located on its deck. The first group of accumulator batteries was installed in the hold. The third, control room with the conning tower on top of it. The artillery magazine found its place in the compartment's hold. The fourth, aft battery compartment. The petty officers' mess hall and 24 crew bunks were on its deck. The second group of batteries was installed in the hold. The fifth, diesel compartment. The sixth, electromotive compartment. Armament. 10 533mm torpedo launchers, 6 at the bow and 4 aft, with 2 of them in the superstructure. Ammunition, 24 torpedoes. Artillery armament. 2 100mm B-24PL dual-purpose guns, 2 45mm 21K dual-purpose guns, 2 7.62mm M1 removable machine guns. The boat carried 20 EP ground anchor mines, developed for fleet submarines, which could be deployed with a mining device located underneath the control room. Power plant. 2 diesel engines, 4,200 horsepower each. A diesel generator, 800 horsepower. 2 electric engines, 2,400 horsepower each. 2 groups of accumulator batteries, 240 elements each. Maximum surface speed, 21 knots. Maximum submerged speed, 10.3 knots. Submergence depth, 80 meters. Maximum depth, 100 meters.
Cruising range at 10 knots, surfaced 7,500 miles, submerged 11.5 miles. Endurance 50 days, maximum time submerged 72 hours. Crew 66 people.
The boat had it all: a long cruising range, high speed, powerful torpedo armament, with 10 torpedo launchers, and moreover, she could set mines. But in order for a sub to have good underwater maneuverability, you need one kind of hull shape. To make her agile on the surface, you need a slightly different hull shape. And if you plan to use the boat as an artillery platform, you need a third kind. Soviet engineers, much to their credit, managed to combine all this in one ship. However, all these advantages came at a price. And the price they paid came in the form of the overall lightening of the submarine's hull.
Moreover, when the engineering blueprints were being prepared, errors in the calculations for the metacentric height and boat's load were discovered, which caused stability issues. To fix them, engineers had to remove the gun shields, make the plating of superstructure and conning tower railing out of aluminium, and reduce the thickness of the outer hull to 6 millimeters.
The reduction of the outer hull thickness had very negative consequences. Any explosions of depth charges nearby would cause welded seams to crack, watertight fuel tanks would be compromised, and leaking fuel would expose the submarine's position. Even rough seas could be enough to severely damage the hull. For example, after K1 was hit by a Force 10 storm, her superstructure shifted to such a degree that it jammed the capstan and bow rudders.
However, these individual technical drawbacks of Katyushas weren't that important compared to the shortage of prepared crews. By the end of the 1930s, the USSR hadn't managed to organize the fully fledged training of submarine officers directly in naval schools. The Navy, meanwhile, had only 2 training squads for underwater operations, which prepared commanders and specialists for submarines.
The problem was that these schools weren't able to prepare the necessary number of commanders and specialists at the rate at which the shipbuilding industry was producing new submarines.
By the summer of 1941, the Soviet submarine fleet included 212 ships, 85 in the Pacific Fleet, 67 in the Baltic Fleet, 44 in the Black Sea Fleet, 16 in the Northern Fleet. 118 of them were either under repair or at different stages of construction. The remaining 94 were complemented with crews that underwent practical training directly on them.
The most important thing: a crew required time to master all the machinery. To this end, a training program was developed.
The training program for submarines, adopted in 1938, consisted of 21 tasks. Here are some of them. Task 2, controlling a submarine when submerging, carrying out submerged maneuvers and surfacing. Task 13, attacking a ship sailing along an alternating course with torpedoes from a long initial range. Task 21, joint maneuvers of a group of submarines when evading the enemy. Ships whose crews had complemented all the tasks were considered fully combat ready. The highest certification of a submarine was to successfully complete a submerged attack against a high-speed formation of warships with anti-submarine escorts, moving along a zigzag path. The Soviet submarine fleet had very few certified subs.
So the reality was that despite having a large number of boats at our disposal, only half of them, at best, were combat ready.
Only 2 submarines were fully prepared for combat in the Baltic Sea, 19 in the Black Sea, and none in the Northern Fleet.
On September 17th, K-21 was commissioned into the Northern Fleet, and after very tight and intensive combat training, she went out on her first war patrol.
During the autumn of 1941, Katyushas had to adapt to sailing conditions in the northern Arctic waters first of all. The Barents Sea tested the endurance of the ship and her crew on every cruise. It turned out that surface speed was very much dependent on the sea conditions. At force 5 roughness, which is quite characteristic for Arctic latitudes, speed dropped twofold, while during a storm, a submarine could list up to 50 to 55 degrees.
To help submarines stay on course and maintain their position, a system of automatic movement stabilization was installed. It was able to adjust both course and depth, and was also called the autopilot. However, the electric motors of this system were too noisy, and sailors would often disable it during missions and switch to manual control.
For the German troops in the far north, shipments by sea were virtually the only source of supplies. That's why these routes were the primary target of Soviet submarines throughout the war. However, the enemy didn't conduct large ocean convoys near Norwegian shores, and the K-class cruiser submarines were designed to hunt exactly for this type of convoy. Active transportation was carried out by small groups of ships with modest tonnage that sailed along the shoreline, taking cover in fjords. Often these were common motorboats and mobilized fishing vessels, and it made no practical sense to spend torpedoes on them.
In September 1941, on their way back from a combat cruise, the commanding officer responsible for artillery on K2 suggested firing a blank shot from their main gun when entering the harbour, in honour of their victory. Later, this tradition was adopted by all submarines of the Northern Fleet. It's worth noting that the K-class submarines scored their first and last victory with artillery fire.
In terms of artillery armament, Katyushas surpassed all Soviet submarines of that time. Their 100mm dual-purpose guns were even sometimes used for anti-aircraft defense at home bases. Of course, these submarines found the main application for their guns at sea and near enemy coasts. The events that occurred at the end of 1941 during a combat cruise of K3, when she was helmed by Lieutenant Commander Malafeyev, presents a very characteristic example of this. On December 3, K3 discovered a small convoy off Hammerfest that included the cargo ship Altkirch and 3 submarine chasers. The Soviet submarine carried out an attack, but failed. All torpedoes missed their targets. Moreover, by firing a salvo, the boat revealed herself and was immediately spotted by the enemy escorts. The Germans set chase to K3 at once, and in just a couple of minutes, dropped around 30 depth charges. While evading them, Katyusha hit the ground 3 times, and finally laid on the bottom, with all noisy mechanisms disabled. However, the attack continued, and each new series of charges with the correct depth setting could have become the last for K3. Water started gradually leaking into the pressure hull, but enabling the drainage pumps would cause too much noise. In this critical situation, the captain had one extreme measure left: to surface and engage in an artillery battle. With her 5th salvo, K3 hit the aft of one of the German chasers, where the depth charges were stored. The ship went under almost instantly. The second chaser, armed only to a 20mm autocannons, hurried to disengage by setting a smoke screen. The third ship was too distant, and her salvos fell short of the submarine. K3 disappeared beyond the horizon before the enemy's eyes. Later on, it was found out that an enemy coastal ship had hit a mine cluster deployed by the sub a week prior to those events. Thus, the first mission of K3 in the Northern Fleet turned out to be very successful.
This hatch was used to load anchor mines, which were stored in the hold in mine and ballast tanks. By the way, the submarines of this class proved themselves to be excellent mine layers during the war. More than half of the enemy tonnage they sank was from their mines. But what's most staggering is the audacity of Soviet submariners, who entered narrow Norwegian fjords with unfamiliar fairways on their almost 100-meter-long ships. Often, they were spotted by lookouts on the coast, but cool-headedly ignored all of their signals and requests and deployed mine clusters and minefields across enemy communication routes.
Submarine K1, commanded by Captain Second Rank Mikhail Avgustinovich, holds the absolute record of the Northern Fleet for the number of enemy ships destroyed by mines. During the course of her service, this boat deployed 146 mines that destroyed 5 transports and 2 guard ships. What's interesting is that the number of confirmed victories of Avgustinovich surpassed the number of claimed victories, a very rare exception in the Soviet underwater fleet. Post-war studies showed that the effectiveness of submarines was often overstated. It wasn't caused by their commanders' ambitions, but rather the lack or absence of resources and means to verify the results of an attack. When newspapers or radio informed people of the victories of the Soviet submariners, they didn't require verification anymore. In 1942, when the Red Army suffered a number of crushing defeats on other fronts, the Soviet people badly needed to know that somewhere at least, the enemy was getting successfully hit.
Герой Советского Союза Лунин обычно не ждет врага, а сам ищет его. Лодка пробралась к вражеским берегам во внутренние воды врага. Торпеды атаки! Аппараты тут!
He launched 4 torpedoes at the German task force at battleship Tirpitz.
Точны советские торпеды. На рубке каждой лодки число потопленных ею фашистских кораблей.
10 spare torpedoes were stored in the forward torpedo room, and 6 more were loaded and ready in the launchers. Initially, submarines of this class weren't equipped with a system that enabled bubble-free torpedo launching, which was a substantial tactical disadvantage. The enemy could detect a salvo fired from a submarine and perform evasive maneuvers. Moreover, by firing several torpedoes underwater, the boat risked disclosing her position. For this reason, some Soviet captains fired torpedoes from the maximum effective range. On K-21, the system of bubble-free fire was installed in March 1942.
By the way, it was partially Nikolai Lunin's initiative to install the system for bubble-free torpedo launching. He was an experienced submarine officer who had completed 5 war patrols on submarine Shah 421 and carried out 7 torpedo attacks. On March the 4th, he was appointed as K-21's captain.
An interesting fact, the order giving him command of K-21 came exactly 1 day after the decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, which awarded him the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. Thus, he first became a hero, and the very next day was given command of the largest and most powerful submarine in the Russian Navy.
Everything started with submarine cruisers. I mean, a plethora of new things were introduced on ships after World War II, and the first ships to accommodate such novelties were cruiser submarines. Hygiene was improved and more bunks were installed. Each sailor, petty officer, midshipman and officer had their own bunks. Water distillers were installed for the first time, 2 distillers, each of which was able to provide around 40 litres of distilled water per hour. The most interesting part, stall showers were installed. You know, in practice, such things as distilling water, heating water, and everything related to it is just wasted energy. Almost no commander would agree to spend energy on water and potentially spend the resources required for a torpedo attack or the chance to flee from enemy ships after an attack. I mean, from submarine chasers and destroyers. Our grandfathers served on submarines in the north in severe and Spartan conditions. Moreover, the submarines of the time didn't even have any heating.
On June the 18th, 1942, K-21 started her fifth raid. For 10 days, the submarine cruised along the northern coastline of Norway, searching for targets. During the night of June 28, Lunin received an order to move to another location close to Cape Nordkin to cover convoy PQ-17. Several days later, the Allies learned that a task force of surface ships, headed by Tirpitz, had set sail. The largest German ship was a highly valuable piece on the board, and by losing this piece, the Kriegsmarine would lose their advantage in the north. Both opposing parties knew that, which was why the German command valued concealment and secrecy most of all while planning their operations. The Allies, in their turn, took all possible measures to detect Tirpitz. In the evening of July 4, convoy PQ-17 received the fatal order to spread out. The German squadron wasn't aware of this and continued along their previous course. By the second half of the next day, the squadron had neared Cape Nordkin.
The characteristics of the listening sonar installed on K-21 weren't that impressive, but Lunin was lucky enough to have a good sonar operator. At 16:22 on July the 5th, 1942, he reported to the officer of the watch that he had heard some indistinct noise.
The noise was getting louder at a course angle of 30 degrees on their starboard. The commander ordered the sub to turn and extended the periscope several times in order to identify the source of the noise. As the boat continued moving towards them, dim outlines transformed into large ships, escorted by destroyers. Lunin declared a torpedo attack state on K-21.
The enemy was following an irregular course. In other words, the ships were moving in formation, an anti-submarine formation. It meant there was a group of destroyers in front of three large ships, which were moving in a front formation. The task of the destroyers moving ahead of large ships in a front formation is to detect submarines. Not just detect submarines, but force them to change their course. Either a submarine is detected, or she will try to avoid the collision at periscope depth. Therefore, when a submarine submerges and then surfaces, she will have only one chance to attack, because the ships are moving at high speed.
Initially, Lunin planned to attack using the bow torpedo launchers, but at 17:50, he raised the periscope and saw that the squadron had changed the course. This made a torpedo attack from the bow launchers impossible. The commander made a decision to launch the aft torpedoes.
A lack of experience in attacking fast-moving targets with strong escorts, imperfect tracking devices, errors in analyzing target motion, and the risk of being revealed with an additional extension of the periscope, all these and other factors made it harder to prepare a torpedo attack. Nevertheless, Lunin made a second attempt, a risky one, to launch torpedoes at a receding target from an obtuse angle. According to his calculations, the distance was maximum but acceptable. At a particular moment, K-21 was surrounded by the escort ships and could have been detected. Lunin gathered all the data for a launch, extended the periscope, and waited for the target to enter the computed zone.
The parameters he had indicated that the attack would be successful. He launched 4 torpedoes at the German task force at battleship Tirpitz.
Immediately after the torpedo salvo, K-21 submerged to 30 meters and left the attack area at full speed. Approximately an hour later, a radiogram was received at the Coastal Command HQ of the Northern Fleet. At 1800, latitude 71 degrees 25 north, longitude 23 degrees 40 east, attacked enemy ships comprising battleships Tirpitz and Scheer, and 8 destroyers, attacked battleship Tirpitz, heard 2 blasts, commander of K-21.
Meanwhile, in the north, far away from K-21, German aviation and submarines were pillaging convoy PQ-17. Soviet destroyers left the northern fleet bases and aircraft took off from the coastal aerodromes to search for the enemy. The radiogram from Lunin was still being decoded on the coast, which is why nobody knew the exact location of the German task force. Nevertheless, everyone understood that they had to be detected at any cost.
At 1916, the German squadron was detected by the crew of the Il-4 airplane from the 2nd Guards Composite Air Regiment. Severe weather conditions obstructed the flight. Low clouds and fog made it almost impossible to detect the enemy ships. But the persistence of Soviet pilots in fulfilling their mission was rewarded. The pilot noticed a small gap between the clouds, plotted the course in that direction, and found himself right above the enemy forces.
The scout immediately sent a message about detecting a German squadron comprising 11 ships and following a course of 65 degrees at a speed of 10 knots. The error in determining the squadron's speed played a crucial part in the coming events. The text of the decoded radiogram from K-21 and data from the reconnaissance aircraft led to the conclusion that the speed of the German squadron had been reduced because one of the ships had received serious damage. It proved that Lunin's attack had been successful.
After our British allies received the message about detecting the German task force, they radioed it in such a way that guaranteed the Germans would intercept it. And they did intercept the message in 2 hours and decoded it. The message was decoded both by the task force and on the mainland. The German command saw the message as a reason to abort the operation. That message had basically eliminated the secrecy that was the top priority of the German command. They realized that they had been discovered. Moreover, there were messages from aviation and submarines stating that the convoy had been dispersed and was being successfully destroyed by aviation and submarine forces. So the capital ships had nothing to do there.
In the evening of July 8, the Soviet Information Bureau transmitted a message saying that the submarine under the command of Captain 2nd Rank Nikolai Lunin had scored 2 torpedo hits on German battleship Tirpitz. The news about the torpedo attack on the largest German ship was published not only in the main Soviet papers, but a corresponding note was also released in the foreign press. This was why, the following day, when K-21 arrived at the base, the whole world was already aware of the heroic deed of the submarine and her commander. By the fall of 1942, after the events of the 5th raid had been reviewed in detail, Nikolai Lunin and his submarine K-21 were decorated with the Order of the Red Banner. Over time, that attack had created a plethora of speculations and assumptions, and finally became a legend that still causes many arguments.
It's all clear from the historical perspective. The specific facts, which are now available to everyone who's eager to study them, undeniably suggest that the attack took place, but that it was unsuccessful. However, the attack itself was a heroic deed in any case. Lunin did everything he could, and everything he had been taught. The first torpedo attack failed, but he still took a risk and attempted a second attack. That was the first and only attack by our submarines on large enemy surface ships.
In November 1943, Nikolai Lunin became commander of the 1st Submarine Division of the Northern Fleet. 6 months later, he was sent to the Military Naval Academy. He graduated from the academy after the war ended. Submarine K-21 had 7 more war patrols, primarily for laying mines. At the time of her last raid, the conning tower of the submarine was decorated with the number 17, the number of her victories.
As a matter of fact, the combat cruises of submarine K-21 ended on April 12, 1944. She required mid-life repairs, and after being docked, she didn't take part in any further military actions until the end of the war. That might have saved the life of the submarine and her crew, because she was the only submarine out of 6 boats of her class that survived the war.
After being decommissioned from the Navy in 1954, K-21 was converted into a training facility where submariners practiced survivability skills. In 1981, the Military Council of the Fleet proposed to make submarine K-21 a memorial to honor all the submariners who had died during the war. 4 compartments were rebuilt as a museum, so just the forward torpedo room, forward battery room, and control room with the conning tower remained almost unchanged.
The victories of submariners from the Northern Fleet are sacred to me, no matter what anyone says. The numbers can be exaggerated or underrated, To my mind, it would be an insult, not only to me, but to the veterans who are no longer here with us, when someone who only read the numbers would say, "Come on, how many ships did you sink?" You say? You just sailed about at sea, and that's it. In wartime, huh? In the conditions of the North, a patrol by any submarine is already a heroic deed because their crews always left the base with a one-way ticket. They never knew whether they would return or not.
It's not hard to understand the idea of the memorial's creators. A famous warship, the only preserved K-class boat of the Northern Fleet, united with the coast that she once defended. It symbolizes the memories of the heroic deeds of Soviet submariners that are preserved by today's sailors, and the connection which unites them.
Sailors, stay calm.
You can activate your bonus code up to April 27th. Don't panic, stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe, as there are more bonus codes to come. Have a lovely time. Fair winds and following seas.